Hello everyone and welcome back to the Unexplained Diaries. Here on this channel I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. I was sitting on the back porch of my parents' cabin up in the Sawtooth Mountains late August 2021. It had been a long day hiking, and I'd stayed behind to catch some quiet time while my sister and her husband went out to explore one of the nearby ridges. The sky was impossibly clear that evening, stars everywhere, no clouds, no moon, just a dark velvet stretch dotted with pinpoints of light. I had my thermos of coffee with me, and I was leaning back in the old wooden chair, just letting the night settle. I noticed a single star that seemed off. It was brighter than the rest, but more than that, it almost looked solid, like a little white dot someone had painted on the sky. I pointed it out to myself, muttering under my breath, and for a while, I just watched it, thinking maybe it was a satellite catching sunlight or an airplane far off. After a few minutes, it moved. Not in the way a plane drifts across the sky or a satellite arcs smoothly. This one drifted sideways, almost lazily, as if it were being nudged by some invisible current. The movement was subtle at first, barely perceptible. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks, but then I saw it again, sideways, not up or down, just shifting left over maybe 10 degrees of sky in what must have been a couple of minutes. I got up and started pacing the porch, keeping my eyes locked on it. My first thought was that it had to be some kind of drone, maybe someone testing one near the ridge, but the area was remote. No other lights, no sound, no way a drone could be that far away and still hold a steady glow without blinking. I grabbed my phone to see if I could get a zoomed-in shot. The screen just made it a brighter dot. Nothing more. I kept zooming, adjusting focus, thinking maybe if I got a closer look I could tell it was a plane, a helicopter, anything familiar. But the more I looked, the stranger it got. The dot didn't have navigation lights, no blinking, no red and green lights, just constant, steady white. Then, as I watched, it disappeared. I mean, literally vanished. 1 second it was drifting slowly, the next it was gone. There wasn't a cloud, nothing to obscure it. I scanned the sky for a while, moving my head side to side, trying to catch it somewhere else. Nothing. I muttered out loud, "What the hell?" and my own voice sounded strange in the quiet. I went back to my chair and tried to shake it off, thinking maybe it was a meteor that had just disappeared behind the horizon or something atmospheric I didn't understand. But I kept glancing up. And that's when the rest of the night got weird. I started noticing little odd things. Sounds at first, faint, almost imperceptible. A soft rustle in the trees behind the cabin. I figured it was deer or some small animal moving through the underbrush. Then a little later, a branch snapped, closer this time. My stomach tightened. I could see nothing in the darkness beyond the porch light. The woods were deep, dense, and shadowy. I stood up and walked around the porch, trying to get a view into the tree line. The wind was calm, no insects buzzing. The night seemed unnaturally quiet. Usually, even late at night, you hear a frog, a cricket, or an owl. Nothing, just the echo of my own footsteps on the wooden boards. I went back to my chair and sat down again, keeping my eyes on the patch of sky where the bright star had been. I started to notice tiny inconsistencies. Stars in the same area seemed different. Not flickering the same way, not exactly the same positions I remembered. I kept squinting and counting points of light, and every time I looked away, a few stars seemed to shift slightly, as if I were misremembering their positions. But it wasn't just me. My sister had mentioned earlier she was watching the sky too from the ridge, and she said she'd never seen the stars look so bright and clear. About an hour later, I saw it again, or something like it. A small point of light far to the east, not where I had seen it first, moving with the same deliberate sideways drift. I sat completely still, breath caught, not wanting to scare myself with imagination. It moved slowly, stopped, and then disappeared just as suddenly as before. I debated waking my sister to ask if she saw anything, but something held me back. She was half a mile away, and there was no way she'd hear me without yelling, and I had this uneasy feeling that I shouldn't call attention to it. Not like fear exactly, more like instinctive caution. The rest of the night passed quietly, though I couldn't sleep. Every so often, I'd catch a faint glimmer where I thought I'd seen the drifting star, only for it to vanish when I blinked or turned my head. The air felt thicker, almost heavier than usual, and the woods seemed like they were holding their breath. By morning, everything looked normal again. The sun came up, shadows stretched across the meadow, birds called to one another, and the little stream by the cabin sparkled in the light. No weird lights, no drifting stars. The air smelled like pine and earth. Nothing to suggest what had happened the night before. I hiked up to meet my sister and her husband at the ridge. They were talking about seeing a deer run along the ridge at dusk, completely oblivious to the strange sky I'd been staring at. I asked if they noticed anything unusual about the stars, and they laughed. Nope, just stars. Why? You didn't see a satellite or something? I hesitated, then said nothing. I didn't want to sound insane, and honestly, I didn't fully understand what I'd seen myself. I drove home later that day, taking the long route down the winding mountain roads. The sky was clear, the sun warm. I kept glancing up, half expecting a repeat of the previous night. Nothing. Just regular stars now, completely normal. Even now, months later, I can picture it clearly. The bright, solid dot drifting sideways in the sky, moving like nothing I've ever seen. No explanation fits, and I keep catching myself glancing at the night sky, hoping to see it again, even though I don't know if I want to. I was hauling a load down Highway 287, just south of Laramie, Wyoming, late September 2022. It was that kind of cold night where the asphalt seems to shrink under the tires and the air bites through your jacket, even while sitting in a heated cab. I'd been driving since mid-afternoon, listening to country on the CB and the radio to keep myself from nodding off. The sky was clear, stars all over, no clouds, no moon, just dark, empty, and wide. I was coming down a long stretch with nothing around for miles, the mountains on my left fading into the dark when my radio started acting weird. At first, it was just static, the kind you ignore for a second and then catch yourself glancing at the dial. But then it got worse. One station after another cut out completely. The CB was dead too. Just silence. Nothing but that soft hum of the engine and the tires against the road. I reached up and twisted the knobs, thinking maybe it was a fuse or some interference, but everything was normal. I glanced out the windshield, just the highway stretching straight ahead under a black sky. Then over the ridge on the right side, I noticed a light. At first, I thought maybe a plane, but it didn't move like one. No blinking, no navigation lights, just a steady, pale glow, hovering above the highway, above the ridge. It wasn't bright enough to hurt your eyes, more like a soft lantern suspended in space. I eased the truck over to the shoulder, killing the engine to see if it was something reflected off my mirrors or cab. The light didn't move. It just stayed there, completely still. I craned my neck, trying to figure out what it could be. Then it moved. Not like a plane or helicopter, more like it slid sideways and upward at the same time, silently. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, thinking maybe my mind was playing tricks. Cold air from the cracked window brushed my cheek, the only sound besides the engine's idle now gone. Then everything got unnervingly quiet. Not just the radio, but the engine, the tires, even the slight wind outside seemed to stop. I leaned forward, eyes wide, and that's when I saw it clearly. A disc. Glowing, smooth, perfectly circular, moving slowly across the ridge. No sound. Nothing mechanical, nothing that made sense. It wasn't moving like a helicopter or plane, more like it was floating. My stomach sank and my hands tightened on the wheel. I wanted to move, but I didn't know which direction was safe. The light expanded slightly, just enough to make the edges visible, like it was a lens catching what little ambient light there was. I could make out a sort of curvature, no markings, no windows, no propellers, just a smooth, solid disc. I thought about calling in, trying the CB again. Nothing. The static wouldn't stop, then it went completely dead again. I remember trying to rationalize it, telling myself it was a reflection off the windshield or some strange optical illusion caused by the road lights behind me. But there were no lights. Nothing behind me for miles. And the more I stared, the more I felt this pressure in my chest, like the silence itself was thickening, pressing down from the sky. Then, just as abruptly as it appeared, The disc moved straight up. I swear it lifted almost instantly, but without a sound, without turbulence, just gone, vanished into the black sky above. And the moment it was gone, everything returned. The engine's hum came back, the tires on asphalt, the wind in the cab, and the radio sputtered back to life. Stations returned, static fading like nothing had happened. I sat there a few minutes, gripping the wheel, trying to make sense of it. There was no one around, no other cars, no lights, no planes. Just me and the echo of what I'd seen. The highway stretched on ahead, dark and empty. I started the engine, trying to drive, but my hands shook so badly I had to grip the wheel with both hands and take deep breaths. For the next hour, I kept glancing at the sky, half expecting it to come back, but nothing. Just stars, perfectly normal, and the mountains on either side, dark and silent. I called into dispatch to check in. They didn't say anything about planes or anything unusual in the area, just the usual static check-in. I didn't mention the disc. I couldn't, not without sounding crazy. When I finally got into Cheyenne, the sun was starting to lighten the sky and I could see the mountains clearly again, solid and real. I parked the rig, got out and walked around, looking for anything unusual. Nothing. No tracks, no lights, nothing. Just gravel, asphalt, and early morning chill. I drove the rest of the route home in silence, trying to convince myself it was a trick of my eyes, the cold, maybe fatigue, but I know what I saw. Nothing I've ever experienced or read about fits it neatly. It wasn't a plane, a helicopter, a drone, or anything conventional. Just that smooth, silent disc and the sudden total silence that came with it. Even now, months later, whenever I drive that stretch or even just look at the night sky, I keep thinking about that disc. About how it moved, about the way the silence seemed to reach inside the cab and press against my ears, my chest, like it was aware I was there. I've told a few fellow truckers about the radio cutting out, and they nod, saying, static does funny things sometimes, but they weren't there. They didn't see it. And I know what I saw. It wasn't like the stories you read online, all explosions and lights dancing across the sky. It was quiet, deliberate, and impossible. And maybe that's the worst part, not the sight itself, but the silence it left behind, lingering long after the disc disappeared and the world went back to normal. I was in the kitchen just past midnight, leaning against the counter with a mug of instant coffee, when it happened. The house was quiet except for the old refrigerator humming in the corner, the kind of hum that makes you think you're imagining other sounds. Then I heard it, static. Full, crackling, rushing static like a storm on AM, but it was coming from the radio on the shelf. Only the radio wasn't plugged in. The cord trailed limply over the edge, and I'd been staring at it for 10 minutes before it happened. I froze, coffee halfway to my mouth, staring at the black plastic box that should have been dead. I muttered, "No way," out loud, and the static swelled a little louder, then softened like it was breathing. My first thought was a hallucination, too much caffeine, stress from work, but the sound was persistent, full-bodied, and real enough to make my teeth hurt a little. I set the mug down, trying to rationalize, and the sound stopped abruptly. Dead silence. Nothing except the refrigerator. I went to the window above the sink out of habit, looking at the dark field beyond the yard. It's just a flat pasture, a line of trees at the far end, nothing remarkable, nothing with lights except the occasional distant farmhouse. That's when I saw it, a soft, pulsing glow, low to the ground, moving slowly across the field. It was pale white, almost gray, like a diluted flashlight, and it seemed to breathe, fading and brightening in a rhythm that matched nothing natural I'd seen before. When I blinked, it had shifted slightly farther along, smooth, deliberate, unhurried, without the wobble of any drone or animal lantern. I knew. I opened the window for a better look, the cold night air brushing my face. The sound came back, low at first, like the static was echoing across the field itself. I swore the pulses of light and the rise and fall of the sound were synchronized. Light brightens, static peaks, then both fade. I leaned closer, gripping the windowsill, trying to see what it was. There was no discernible shape, just that glow drifting across the grass, silent except for the eerie accompaniment of static. I grabbed my phone and snapped a picture, mostly to prove I wasn't losing it. The screen came back black. I tried the camera again, moved to the doorway, and the static seemed to follow me, like the house itself was humming with it, even though the radio still sat unplugged. My ears felt strained. The sound wasn't piercing, but it carried weight, a density that made me tense. Then it stopped. Everything stopped. The glow blinked out, the static vanished, and even the refrigerator seemed quieter. I rubbed my eyes and stepped back. Maybe I'd imagined it, the old brain playing tricks after a long day, but the field looked different somehow. Lighter at the edges, almost damp with something I couldn't place. I tried to shake the feeling. I poured the rest of the coffee, muttering that it was nothing. I sat at the counter and waited. The static returned, fainter this time, almost hesitant, and then vanished again without the light accompanying it. I noticed the clock. 15 minutes had passed in a blur. When I looked at the window again, the glow returned. Same pulsing rhythm, drifting across the field in slow, smooth arcs. My heart picked up, but I kept reminding myself it had to be something explainable. A flashlight, a car, a neighbor's work light. But the field was empty. I opened the back door quietly, stepping out onto the porch to get a better look. The air smelled sharp, dry, like the night had been scrubbed clean of everything else. I crept to the edge of the yard. The glow moved silently, never touching the trees, never flickering from wind or leaves. My phone rang out of nowhere. A text I didn't recognize, no number, just a string of nonsense characters. I stared at it and dropped the phone, feeling my pulse spike. By the time I bent to pick it up, the light had vanished and the static died again, leaving nothing but the normal hum of the world. I went back inside, doors locked, lights dim. I tried to explain it to myself, maybe some kind of electrical interference, maybe a prank, maybe a strange reflection. Nothing accounted for the timing, the rhythm, or the way it seemed aware of me being out there. I couldn't shake the sensation that it had paused, watching, waiting, testing how I'd react. I sat down with a notebook and started jotting details, times, duration, intensity, everything I could remember. Every time I looked up, the field seemed normal, mundane, yet I knew it wasn't. There was an afterimage, a residue of motion, like the night remembered something I didn't. Sleep came eventually, fitful and shallow. I woke around 4 a.m., checked the window, the field empty, the world silent except for the refrigerator. I walked through the house, every door, every light switch, double-checking. Everything normal, unremarkable, mundane. By morning, I could almost convince myself it was a dream. Almost. But the unplugged radio sat on the shelf, still and black, no power, no cord anywhere attached. And for days after, whenever I passed it, the memory of that pulsing light and the accompanying static made me pause. I went back to the porch at night, looked at the field, but nothing appeared. No glow, no static, nothing but the wind in the grass and the distant low hum of traffic far away. I thought about telling someone, anyone, but what could I say? A pulsing light, static from an unplugged radio, a field that felt alive. The words sounded crazy even in my head, so I kept it to myself. Sometimes late, I'll catch a shimmer at the edge of my vision, a blink too quick for a star. I'll check the radio out of habit. Plugged in or not, the static is gone now, but I can swear the silence feels different. Waiting. Patient. And some nights, when the wind is right, I swear I can hear it. Soft, low, just at the edge of hearing, like a signal I can't quite tune. I was pulled over at the turnout above Pebble Cove because the sky was doing that slow, honest burn you only get over the ocean in October. The heat of the day had left the asphalt and the air felt clean and a little sharp, like someone had wiped the world with a cold rag. I'd driven out from town to clear my head after a long shift at the marina. There's something about the water and the line of horizon that tightens my thoughts into place. My name's Eric Maldonado, and I fish the coastal run in summer and do odd jobs the rest of the year. That night, I sat on the hood of my truck with a thermos and my binoculars, watching the sun sink into a smear of peach and then deep indigo. Small odd things piled up before the thing in the sky happened, and at the time, I shrugged most of them off because it was late, and you're a little tired, and people get weird about their surroundings when they're alone. First, my stereo did that jumpy thing radios do when the signal is weak. The host's voice stuttered and got swallowed by static twice, Then the station snapped back like nothing had happened. I thought it was simply a dodgy antenna. The stretch of Highway 12 up there always kills reception. Then a gull flew past and didn't make a sound. Not the usual wheeze or arcing cry, just wing and feather, a silent shadow. I blinked and the bird was gone. The turnout's old cast iron lamp glowed on a timer. It turned on when the sun dipped, and that night it flickered once in a slow, deliberate blink, as if someone had taken a match to it. That bit made me frown because the timers in those old boxes don't flicker. They click or they don't. My phone in my jacket pocket pinged with an incoming message I hadn't noticed. The battery icon sliding down a smidge even though I'd plugged it in earlier at a cafe. I pulled it out and the notification was from my sister. "You okay?" Which I thought was odd. She doesn't text like that. I clicked the message open and the timestamp read 10 minutes ahead of the clock on my dash. I frowned, locked the screen, and told myself to stop reading meaning into coincidences. The sunset let the stars up fast. It was the kind of clear night where you think about satellites and watch them draw slow arcs across the firmament. I had the binoculars up mostly to kill time. You see small things out there, satellites, planes, the occasional Coast Guard transport with its throat full of noise. When the light first caught my eye, it looked like a plane in the distance, steady white, low, coming up the coast in the corridor between capes. It held that familiar airline cadence, no flash, no blinking red, just a forward white like a nursing star. I set the bins, checked the horizon, and assumed it would pass the same as every other plane I'd watched over the years. Except it didn't pass in the smooth arc I expected. For a while it was textbook. Approach vector parallel to the shoreline, steady light, a faint plume in my peripheral that I'd have called exhaust if the world hadn't started doing other small strange things. The gulls on the water had quieted. The headlamps of a caravan of cars on the lower road seemed to hesitate, one by one, their beams dimming a hair as if someone had turned a knob at random. The radio sputtered again, this time leaving a soft, high hiss for a couple of seconds before resolving back into the late-night host chatting about weather. I watched the object get closer. At maybe a mile out, you could have convinced me it was a small private plane. Maybe a Cessna cutting up the coast because the pilot liked the view. Then it made the turn. It was a right angle. Not a shallow bank or a cheaty climb. An exact, clean 90-degree turn that repositioned its nose perpendicular to the flight path and did it without slowing down. My body reacted before my brain did. I felt that little clench runners get when the ground jumps under their foot. The binoculars shook in my hands. The motion wasn't a glide or a curve. It was a geometric cut, like someone snapped the object on a hinge. There was no banking, no roll, nothing you see when trained pilots change vector. It rotated and sliced along a new axis so fast, the light drew a short, bright line across the stars and then leveled out. When it turned, I expected the sound. I wrapped my glove tighter around the metal of the hood because if an engine was about to scream, you'd hear it in the ribs. But there was nothing. No turbine whine, no propeller wash, not even an air crackle. The night held its breath. The only noise was the distant drip of surf and the smallest rustle of my jacket. And then, without ease, without fade, the thing was gone. One instant, a white pin punched in the bowl of the sky, then nothing but stars and the slow sweep of the cosmos. No contrail, no trail of anything. It vanished like someone had closed a door you didn't know was there. I sat back hard enough to register pain in my lower back, my thermos slipping a little in the dirt. The binoculars dangled useless at my chest. For a minute, I just watched the patch of sky where it had been, willing some piece of ordinary sense to return. The stars were where they'd been before. The air smelled like tide and spilled diesel from a far berth. Cars up on the road clicked their turn signals and lost them like a small, nervous habit. The lamp at the turnout steadied. No more flicker. The clock on my dash ticked forward like a metronome. I did the things you do when you want the world to be sensible. I called the small municipal airport back in town, an after-hours line they publish for pilots. The voice on the other end was polite and distant. He asked for my location and then told me there'd been no IFR traffic listed at that time, no reports on the VHF, nothing on the tower's informal net. He suggested maybe I'd seen a satellite flare or a meteor. I said I'd watched it turn. He was quiet for a moment and then said the radar sweep at the airport didn't show any track in that sector, that sometimes small transponders don't show up, but usually that also means you can hear something. I thanked him and hung up because the conversation had nowhere else to go. People tried to help me make sense of it the next day. Pilot friends said it was impossible. Kids in the diner told fantastical versions of my one sentence of truth between bites of pie, and someone posted a shaky phone clip on the local page that had a bright blur and a lot of audio fill. None of it matched the precise 90-degree in my head. None of it accounted for the radio hiss, the silent gull, the lamp's slow blink. The more I tried to explain, the more my own memory felt like a stack of photographs taken by someone else, clear close-ups set beside oddly missing frames. I went home, drove the coast road again in daylight to see if perspective could flatten the moment. The bay looked ordinary in sun, charred kelp lines, a lone buoy cleaner beeping in the distance. I made the stop at the same turnout and stood with my hands in my pockets, listening. People walked dogs, kids biked the shoulder, someone rolled down a window, and the sound of laughter fell into the scene like water into a glass. The day repaired the night in small, predictable increments. At night, though, I find myself watching the sky more carefully. I catch myself checking the horizon like it's an unpaid tab I ought to settle. Once in a while, a plane insists on a lazy arc. A satellite makes a slow comet of light, and my hands relax with ordinary recognition. Other times, small things slip out of place. The radio hisses, a lamp blinks, my phone decides to flirt with the future, and that taut, pricking awareness rises in my chest. I have no mechanical explanation that fits every detail without making excuses. I didn't crash. No one else disappeared. The sky didn't stay populated with blinking things. I slept in my own bed that night the way everyone goes back to normal, and in the morning I clipped a line and set a day's worth of gear out on the dock and told the story to a buddy over coffee like a man who keeps the oddness as a folded map in his back pocket. It sits folded in there now. A white point that changed direction in a way no plane should. A slice in the sky and then nothing. The world carried on. Boats left and returned, gulls screamed and were heard again. I made it back to the marina, checked the nets, and then set out the bait. The horizon looks the same as it always did, but I watch it with that small, careful skepticism you get after something unreasonable happens, and you come back from it alive. It was early September, a little before dawn, and I was out checking the herd. I live outside of Hastings, Nebraska, on about 120 acres. Most mornings, I make a round before sunrise just to make sure nothing's wrong. Cattle can get into trouble fast if a fence goes down or they spook during the night. That morning, the air was cool but humid, and there was a thin fog hanging low to the ground, the kind that makes everything look flattened and pale. I was on foot because the ground had gotten soft from a couple days of late summer storms. I took my flashlight, though I barely needed it since the moon was still high. I expected to find the cows near the southern pasture, where they usually stick together at night. But when I came over the slight rise, I froze. They weren't scattered like usual. All 30 or so head were standing in a circle, not milling around, not bunched up in a clump, but a perfect ring. Every single one of them was facing inward, heads down, no sound. Not even the soft shifting noises cattle always make when they breathe and move. Just stillness. At first I thought they were crowding around something. Coyotes, maybe. A calf down. But as I got closer, I saw there was nothing in the middle of the circle, just a patch of damp grass. I stood there longer than I probably should have, trying to make sense of it. The fog pooled around their legs, so it looked even stranger, like they were floating in a white haze. I noticed how unnatural their silence was. Usually if I walk up, a few will snort or stomp. Instead, they held completely still, ears stiff, like they were under some kind of spell. I called out, "Ho!" just to break the tension. Nothing. Not one of them flinched. I started forward slowly. The grass squished under my boots, and the sound seemed way too loud in the quiet. I was about 20 feet away when it happened. They all bolted at once. Not gradually, not like one cow spooked and set off the rest. It was instant. The entire circle broke apart like something had exploded in the middle, only there was nothing there. They scattered in all directions, bawling and stumbling through the fog, tails up. I swear I felt a push of air hit me when they went, like something invisible had shot outward as they ran. For a few seconds, I just stood there with my flashlight aimed at the empty circle. My chest was pounding. I knew cattle could act weird, but I'd been around them my whole life, and I'd never seen anything like that. When I finally stepped into the center of where they'd been, the ground looked no different than the rest of the field. Same damp grass, same patches of mud. But I kept turning, looking over my shoulder like someone else might be out there. The fog muffled everything, so even when the herd was crashing around in the distance, it sounded far away and wrong. I checked for tracks. Of course, the circle was trampled down from all their hooves, but I didn't see anything else. No signs of coyotes, no sign of anything. I told myself it could have been a predator they smelled, something I didn't see, maybe a bobcat. But that didn't explain the circle, or how perfectly still they were until I walked closer, or how they all scattered the exact same second, like a signal went off. I stayed out there until the sun started to burn off the fog, mostly because I didn't want to walk back to the house with my back turned to that empty circle. When the light came up, the cattle had regrouped near the northern fence line. They were acting normal again, grazing, flicking tails. If someone had shown up then, they wouldn't have believed what I saw just an hour earlier. Later that morning, I told my neighbor Cliff when I saw him at the feed store. He laughed at first, said I probably spooked them myself. But then he got quiet and said his brother in Kansas once found his herd all facing the same direction for no reason. Said they wouldn't move until he clapped his hands. Then they bolted just like mine had. He didn't stick around to check for signs. That stuck with me. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept thinking about how the cattle didn't move until I got close, almost like whatever was holding them there only released them because I interrupted. And that rush of air I felt, it was real. I know it. I never found tracks. No broken fence, no dead calf. Just a memory of 30 silent animals standing in a perfect circle in the fog, and the way they scattered as if something I couldn't see had finally left. I was backpacking alone in the winters, late summer of 2019. I had taken a few days off work and figured I'd get in one more trip before the weather started to turn. The plan was simple: 2 nights out, loop through some lakes, and back to my truck by Sunday afternoon. I've done solo hikes plenty of times, and while there's always a little unease being out there without anyone else, I actually like the quiet. That Friday evening, I set up camp near a small meadow about a mile below a ridgeline. There weren't any other tents around, and I hadn't seen anyone on the trail for hours. It was one of those unusually warm nights where the air doesn't cool down much after sunset, so I sat outside my tent for a long time, just sipping water and listening to crickets. Sometime after 10 p.m., I saw what looked like a flare. At first, I thought someone must have gotten into trouble. The light dropped down behind the ridge to the west, bright orange-red, just like a flare would look if it was fired into the sky and floated down. It even flickered a little, like it was burning. I stood up right away and watched, expecting to hear shouting or maybe see another light. But after it sank below the ridge, nothing. No noise, no smoke. I pulled out my headlamp and waved it around a bit, but there was no response. I considered packing up to climb the ridge and check, but it would have been a tough hike in the dark, and I didn't want to leave my camp if it turned out to be nothing. I decided I'd wait and see if anything else happened. A few minutes later, it did. The same light came back up. Not like another flare being fired. This was the exact same one, I'm sure of it. It rose straight upward, smooth and steady, not drifting at all. No sound, no trail of sparks, just a glowing orb going straight up until it got smaller and smaller and finally disappeared into the stars. I stood there frozen with my hands on my hips, trying to process what I'd just seen. The woods around me felt unusually quiet, like the insects had gone still. I waited for some kind of follow-up, another flare, maybe a helicopter, but the sky stayed empty. I sat back down on the log by my tent, but kept my headlamp off. Every few seconds, I'd glance toward the ridge, expecting the light to show up again. It didn't. Around midnight, I gave up and crawled into my sleeping bag. I was almost asleep when I heard footsteps. They were faint but deliberate, soft crunching in the grass near the tree line. Not an animal bounding or scurrying, just steady steps, pausing, then continuing. My first thought was a deer, but the rhythm was too careful, like someone walking slowly. I stayed completely still, listening. The steps circled partway around my camp. They then stopped. I waited for what felt like 10 minutes, heart pounding, before finally unzipping the tent just a little and peeking out. No light, no movement, just the same meadow under starlight. I almost convinced myself I imagined it. But then, further out, I saw a faint glow behind the trees. It wasn't a flashlight beam, it was too soft, too even. It lit up the trunks in a wide area, then faded out after a few seconds. That was enough for me. I stayed in my tent the rest of the night, barely sleeping, just holding my knife and staring at the nylon wall. By morning, everything was normal again. Birds were chirping, the air was warm, and the meadow looked the same as always. I packed up quickly and debated cutting my trip short, but stubbornness won out, and I told myself I'd finish the loop. All day I felt uneasy, though. The trails seemed emptier than usual, and whenever I stopped for water, I had the sensation of being watched. I didn't see any more lights, but I kept scanning the sky. That second night, I set up at a different lake, deeper in the loop. I cooked dinner fast and was in my tent before the sun had even fully set. I couldn't relax. I kept listening for those steps. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a soft humming sound. Not like an engine, lower, almost like when power lines buzz in humid weather. It didn't come from one direction. It seemed to hang in the air all around. I turned on my headlamp and looked at my watch. It was 2:17 a.m. The hum lasted maybe 2 minutes. Then it cut off, leaving the forest silent. I sat awake until dawn, then hiked out the fastest I think I've ever moved with a full pack. I didn't stop until I reached the trailhead. When I got to my truck, there were only 3 other cars in the lot, and one of them had a thin layer of dust like it had been parked for weeks. Driving home, I kept replaying it all in my head. The flare that rose instead of fell, the steps circling my camp, the glow behind the trees, the humming that came from everywhere and nowhere. I can't explain any of it. All I know is I saw a light fall behind a ridge, then climb back up into the sky with no sound at all. And after that, the whole mountain felt wrong. I was sitting in the cockpit at Claiborne Regional in Texas, waiting for my clearance. It was late evening in August, hot even after the sun dipped below the tree line. The air inside the plane was stuffy, and I had the side window cracked just enough to let in a little breeze. My student, a younger guy named Marcus, was in the right seat, flipping through his checklist. We were about to run a few night patterns. Basic touch and goes, nothing complicated. The tower was quiet. Cleburne isn't exactly DFW, and by that hour, the frequency was mostly empty except for us. The horizon still had this faint orange glow that was slowly fading into blue-black. I remember thinking it was a perfect night for training. Clear skies, calm winds, visibility good for miles. I was adjusting my headset when I noticed a light moving across the sky above the north end of the runway. At first, I assumed it was a commercial jet headed toward Dallas, which is common. But the speed wasn't right. It cut across the sky almost like a shooting star. Bright, steady, no tail. Marcus saw me squinting and asked what I was looking at. I pointed it out, and he caught sight of it just as it streaked left to right across the windshield. His first reaction was, "Damn, that's moving." I keyed up the mic and called Tower, asking if they had traffic northbound. The controller, a guy named Jeff, who I'd spoken to 100 times, came back after a second with, "Negative, Cleburne's skies are clear." I asked again, clarifying that it was fast, northeast bound, maybe 20,000 feet or higher. Jeff cut me off. "Nothing showing on radar, not even over Dallas Center. You're good to go." Marcus leaned forward, trying to keep track of the light. By then it had slowed, or at least it looked like it did. It was hard to gauge against the darkening sky, but it definitely wasn't streaking anymore. It just hung there, bright, almost white blue. Way too bright for a star. I remember the strangest thing was how silent it was. At that altitude, I should have at least heard a faint jet rumble if it were something military burning that fast across the sky. but it was dead quiet, except for the hum of our avionics. Maybe a satellite? Marcus said. But satellites don't stop like that. We watched it hover for maybe 10 seconds, then it jerked like a sudden movement to the right, faster than my eyes could really track. One instant it was there, the next it was 30, maybe 40 degrees farther across the horizon. No gradual acceleration, just a snap. Marcus muttered, "What the hell?" I didn't answer. My thumb hovered over the transmit switch, but I didn't want to sound like an idiot. Jeff came back on frequency, asking if we were departing or staying put. I told him standby. The light started moving again, this time climbing higher, almost vertical. Not a steady climb like an aircraft on departure, but like something shot upward at an angle, smooth but unnaturally fast. Within a few seconds, it was just a pinpoint against the dark sky. Then it was gone. Jeff broke the silence. "Skyhawk 942, I don't show any traffic in your area. Are you ready to taxi?" His tone had this edge, like he was annoyed we were holding up the pattern. I didn't answer right away. I was staring at where the light had disappeared, trying to process it. Marcus nudged me, whispering, "Did you see that blink? Right before it vanished?" I hadn't. He swore the light pulsed once, a quick dim, bright dim, and then it was gone. We went through the motions after that, taxied, did 3 circuits. I kept expecting to see it again, but the sky stayed empty, clear, calm, nothing unusual. When we came back in and parked on the ramp, Jeff met us outside the tower. He doesn't usually leave the cab, but he walked over like he wanted to clear the air. He asked, casual as ever, if we'd seen fireworks or maybe a drone. I told him no, it wasn't either. He shrugged, smiled like he was humoring me, and said, "Sky's clear on my scope. Must have been a trick of the eye." Marcus laughed nervously, but I noticed Jeff didn't look at me when he said it. He looked past me toward the runway like he didn't want to meet my eyes. On the drive home, I kept replaying it. The speed, the stop, the way it jerked sideways. Airplanes don't move like that. Satellites don't stop. Shooting stars don't hover. The part that sticks with me the most isn't even the light. It's the way Jeff insisted nothing was there. His tone wasn't dismissive, it was rehearsed, like he'd said that exact phrase before. I was running the Lakeview Trail after work, like I usually did 3 or 4 nights a week. It's about a 3-mile loop that winds around a reservoir outside of town. The path is packed dirt with some gravel mixed in, lined with tall pines on the north side and a stretch of reeds and water on the south. I liked it because it wasn't too crowded in the evenings, usually just a few dog walkers finishing up or another runner or two if I timed it right. That evening was in late August. It was hot during the day, but by the time I got out there it was cooling off, still warm enough that the air held this heavy, humid feeling. The sun had already dipped behind the ridge, so the light was low and kind of orange at first, then quickly turning gray. I just settled into a pace when I noticed this low buzzing sound. At first, I thought it was just a mosquito near my ear, but the sound didn't dart away like that. It was steady, like an electric hum. I pulled my earbuds out, thinking maybe my headphones were glitching, but the noise was still there. It was faint, but it seemed to follow me. I slowed to a jog walk and glanced around. Nothing obvious. The only other person I'd seen was a woman with a golden retriever about a half-mile back. They'd already gone the opposite direction toward the parking lot. I tried ignoring it. Sometimes you catch a sound in your head and fixate on it, convince yourself it's external when it's not. So I pushed on. But about 5 minutes later, when the trail curved near the thicker part of the pines, the buzz was still there, faint but constant. That's when I tilted my head back and caught this little glow above the treetops. It wasn't bright like a street lamp, more like the dim light from a phone screen. A pale white sphere, maybe the size of a basketball if you could measure it, but I couldn't tell how far above the trees it was. It was moving, slowly, smoothly, right above the canopy line, and it was keeping pace with me. I stopped. It stopped. The buzzing stayed like it was leaking out of the air. My chest felt tight. I just stared at it. I thought it had to be a drone. People fly them all the time around the lake. But there were no blinking red or green lights, no propeller sound, no sudden movements. Just that low, even hum. I started walking again, eyes up. The thing slid along with me, perfectly matched, as though tethered. When I broke into a run, it glided faster. When I slowed, it slowed. I tested it a few times, zigzagging on the trail. Each time it adjusted like it was locked on. I pulled my phone out, thumb fumbling to get the camera app open. When I pointed it up, the glow looked dimmer through the screen. I hit record and jogged a few steps. The orb didn't show, just dark treetops against the sky. I lifted my head. There it was, plain as day. Back at the phone, gone. That part shook me more than anything. I tucked the phone away and kept running. My instinct was just to finish the loop and get back to my car. I told myself, don't stop, don't freeze up. Halfway through, the trail runs along the water's edge. It's open there, no trees overhead. I figured if it was going to reveal itself as something normal, that's when it would. But as soon as I stepped out of the cover of the trees, the orb stayed at the tree line. It didn't cross over the open space, just hovered at the edge like it didn't want to be seen against the clear sky. The buzz dipped lower in pitch, almost a vibration I could feel in my ribs. I stopped, bent over, pretending to tie my shoe just to think. My mouth was dry. I waited to see if it would come out, but it didn't. I kept going. Once I got back into the woods, it picked right back up above me. A mile later, I heard footsteps that weren't mine, heavy ones, crunching gravel behind me. I spun around. Trail was empty. The sound cut instantly. The buzzing was louder, though, pressing on me. At that point, I gave up on the workout. I broke into a sprint. My lungs burned, but I didn't care. Every time I dared to glance upward, the orb was gliding right along, perfectly in line, like it was tracking me. When the parking lot finally came into view through the trees, I almost yelled. I forced myself to slow down before breaking into the clearing. I didn't want anyone around to see me panicking like that, but when I looked up, the orb was gone. No sound. Just the evening air, crickets, the faint smell of lake water. I jogged the last stretch out into the open, scanning the treetops, but there was nothing. No glow, no hum. Just the darkening sky and the lot ahead with my car sitting alone. I got in, hands shaking, and sat there for a while. I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see the glow drift over the lot. It never did. When I pulled out onto the road, I rolled the windows down, listening for that buzz. All I heard was the tires on asphalt and the wind. I didn't go back to the trail for 2 weeks after that. And even when I finally did, I couldn't bring myself to run the wooded side. I stuck to the shorter loop around the open water. I kept glancing up, waiting. Nothing like that has happened again. But I still don't wear earbuds out there anymore. I want to hear if something's above me. I was driving home late from my cousin's place in Jasper, Alabama. It wasn't a long drive, maybe 40 minutes, but it was one of those stretches of highway where once you get off the main drag, you don't see much of anything. No streetlights, barely any houses, and a whole lot of pine trees crowding the shoulder. It was around 11 at night, cold but clear, the kind of night where the sky felt sharp and open and you could see every star if you looked long enough. I didn't like taking that road alone, but it cut 20 minutes off the drive, and I figured I'd be fine. I remember glancing at the clock on the dash, 11:08. My headlights lit up the narrow two-lane, nothing but that faded yellow stripe and the dark woods around it. No cars in front of me, none behind me. I'd gone maybe 10 miles without seeing another set of headlights. That was normal. I was halfway through a stretch where the trees broke into fields on either side. I happened to check my rearview mirror and saw a light. Just a bright white light. At first I thought, okay, someone's coming up behind me, but it looked odd. Usually you see two distinct headlights spaced apart. This was just one solid glow, almost like a spotlight. It wasn't bouncing the way headlights usually do on uneven pavement. It was steady, fixed. I figured maybe it was a motorcycle, though it seemed way too bright for that. Still, it was late. I was tired, and I didn't think much of it. I expected it to gain on me fast, but the glow stayed about the same distance back. Not closer, not farther. Just hanging there. A few minutes went by, and it started to get under my skin. I tried not to look in the mirror, but every time I did, that light was there. Perfectly centered. Not swerving, not changing size. I eased my foot off the gas, thinking maybe I was imagining it. But when my car slowed, the light stayed exactly the same distance behind me. That was when I started to feel uneasy. I knew this road. There weren't many turnoffs, and the few driveways you passed were long and usually gated. If someone wanted to tailgate me or mess around, I should have been able to tell what kind of vehicle it was by then. But I couldn't make out anything except that steady white glow. After another mile or so, I decided to pull over. There was a gravel shoulder near the entrance to some logging road, and I figured I'd let this car, or whatever it was, go by. My blinker clicked loud in the quiet, and I coasted off to the side, crunching onto the gravel. I left my headlights on and watched the mirror. But nothing passed. I sat there, my engine idling, waiting. A minute went by. The road behind me was completely empty. No light, no car, nothing. Just black trees and stars above them. I leaned forward over the wheel, squinting. I even rolled down my window a crack to listen, thinking maybe I'd hear tires or an engine. There was only the sound of my own motor and the faint buzz of crickets. The light was gone. I can't explain the feeling that washed over me. Not relief, not exactly. More like this prickling awareness that something wasn't right. I checked the rear view again, then the side mirrors. Still nothing. I pulled back onto the road a little faster this time, half expecting the light to flare up behind me again. For a while it didn't. I forced myself to focus on the yellow lines, on the shape of the road ahead. My hands were gripping the steering wheel too tight, though. About 10 minutes later, just when I was starting to calm down, I glanced in the rear view again. The light was back. Same distance, same steady glow. My stomach dropped. I'd just driven miles without seeing it, and now there it was again, like it had never left. I felt my throat go dry. I pressed the accelerator harder, pushing my little sedan faster than I usually dared on that road. The speedometer crept past 70. Still, the light stayed the same, fixed, unshaken. At one point, I tried to convince myself it was a reflection. Maybe my own headlights bouncing weirdly. But reflections don't behave like that. And the glow wasn't faint or flickering. It was solid, like there really was something there. I remember passing a farmhouse set back off the road. They had a single porch light glowing. For a second, I thought about pulling in, but it was almost midnight, and I didn't want to wake some stranger up babbling about a weird light. So I just kept driving, heart pounding in my ears. The light followed me another 5 or 6 miles, never closer, never farther. Just locked there. My palms were sweaty on the wheel, and I caught myself whispering out loud, "What do you want?" It was the only time I ever talked to it. When I finally reached the junction with the highway, I slowed to make the turn. The second my tires hit the bigger road, I glanced back one more time. The light was gone. No car, no glow, just an empty stretch of 2-lane fading into the dark woods. I stayed on the highway the rest of the way home, even though it added 20 minutes. I kept checking my mirrors, half convinced it would reappear, but it never did. When I pulled into my driveway, it was 11:54. I remember that clearly because I sat there with the engine running, staring at the clock, trying to make sense of what just happened. I hadn't lost time. I hadn't blacked out. It was less than an hour from when I left my cousin's place, just like it should have been. But those miles in between felt stretched out, wrong somehow. I shut the car off and went inside, double-locked the door, and sat in the dark for a long time before I could even think about sleeping. Even now, whenever I drive that stretch, I can't help but check the mirror more than I should. And every time the road behind me looks empty, I half expect that glow to blink back into view. We were camping at Medicine Bow, up in the mountains of southern Wyoming. It was me, my wife Erin, and our 2 kids, Caleb, who was 9 at the time, and Claire, who had just turned 12. We weren't hardcore campers, more like the kind of family that packed too much food, brought along a giant cooler, and drove as close to the campsite as possible. But we all liked being outside, and the kids were still at an age where sitting around a fire and roasting marshmallows was enough to keep them entertained. That night had been pretty uneventful. We'd spent the afternoon walking a short trail, made dinner over the fire, and then just sat around talking. The kids wanted to stay up late, so we let them. I remember looking at my watch at some point. It was just a little after 10 p.m. I wasn't even tired yet, and neither was Erin. The fire was going strong, bright orange, with enough wood left stacked beside it to keep it going for a while. I even remember adding a log around then. What's strange is there's no memory of anyone suggesting bed, no moment where we said, okay, let's call it a night. It's like the next thing I knew, I was opening my eyes, still sitting in my camp chair with my head tilted back. The fire pit was dead cold. Not even a red ember glowing, just gray ash and some blackened wood collapsed in on itself. The air had that really sharp, early morning chill. I could see my breath. For a second, I thought I just dozed off for a while, but then I checked my phone. It said 12:21 a.m. That didn't make sense. At most, we should have been sitting around for another 30 minutes, maybe an hour before going to bed. The fire shouldn't have been out completely, not without anyone touching it. And the weirdest part was that both kids were asleep in their camp chairs, too. Caleb's marshmallow stick was still across his lap. Claire had her hoodie pulled up, slumped forward like she'd nodded off mid-sentence. Erin stirred around the same time I did. She rubbed her eyes, confused, and immediately asked what time it was. I showed her my phone. She frowned and pulled hers out. Same time, 12:21. When the kids woke up, we all had the same question. How did we just lose 2 hours? Nobody remembered going to sleep. Nobody remembered the fire burning down. Caleb swore he'd been awake 1 second and then skipped to morning, except it wasn't morning. Claire just looked shaken, like she was trying to piece it together, but couldn't. At first, I thought maybe it was just my phone glitching. We weren't in a place with much service, so sometimes the clock drifted. But Erin's phone, Claire's, and even Caleb's little hand-me-down iPod all showed the exact same time, 2 hours ahead of what it should have been. We all dug around for our watches. I had my old Casio, Erin had a cheap Timex. Both of those matched the phones. Somehow, every clock we had with us agreed. It was after midnight, but the fire told a different story. We'd fed it a full log around 10. There's no way it could have burned completely out without someone stirring it or tending it. And none of us remembered doing that. The kids wanted to crawl into the tent, but Erin and I just sat there for a while, staring at the fire pit. I kept trying to reconstruct the last thing I remembered. I could picture Claire asking if we had more marshmallows. I could picture Caleb leaning back, poking at the fire. Then, nothing. Just a blank space, and suddenly I was awake again. The silence around us was heavier than normal, too. I know that sounds dramatic, but the forest didn't sound right. No crickets, no wind in the trees, not even the occasional snap of branches. Just stillness. The kind where you catch yourself holding your breath without realizing it. Around 1 a.m., Erin whispered, "Do you hear that?" At first, I didn't. Then I picked it up, a faint humming. Almost like a refrigerator or a power line, except we were miles from the nearest road. It wasn't loud, just steady. Low. We all heard it. Caleb covered his ears, said it was bugging him. I grabbed the flashlight and scanned the trees. Nothing. But the hum seemed to move when I turned. Not louder or quieter, just always there, like it was everywhere at once. We sat like that for maybe 10 minutes. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Not a fade, just cut off like someone flipped a switch, and when it did, the forest came back. I heard crickets again. Something rustled in the brush. It was like the world had gone back to normal. None of us wanted to stay out after that. We put out the rest of the wood, zipped up the food bag, and crammed into the tent. I don't think any of us really slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept expecting to open them and find it was morning. Or worse, that more time had vanished. When the sun came up, the kids were wide-eyed, staring at the tent ceiling. Erin looked pale. I checked my phone again. 6:08 a.m. That was right, or at least it lined up with the sunrise. Packing up felt strange. We didn't talk much, just shoved everything into the car. On the drive back down the mountain, Claire finally asked, "What happened last night?" Nobody answered her. We got home, and that was that. The phones all kept the right time once we were back in service. No weird humming. Nothing out of place. But when I checked the fire pit in my memory, the way it had been cold ash when I woke up, that's the part that won't leave me alone. Fires don't just skip 2 hours of burn time without someone noticing, and 4 people don't all lose track of the same stretch of night like it never happened. I was driving back from a friend's place in Springfield, Missouri. It was close to midnight, a warm summer night. the kind where the air still clings to your skin even after the sun's been down for hours. The roads were mostly empty, just me, my old Accord, and a stretch of suburban streets that eventually wound toward the highway. I hadn't had much to drink, just 2 sodas, so I was wide awake. Windows down, radio low. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where all the houses look the same and every other lawn has a for sale sign stuck in it. I turned onto one of those long, straight roads with evenly spaced streetlights, and that's when I noticed it. The light ahead of me flickered and went out. Not unusual. Old bulbs blow all the time. But then the next one went out, and the next. They didn't all shut off at once like a power outage. It was sequential. As my car moved forward, the streetlights ahead blinked out in perfect order, almost like they were tracking me. I slowed down to maybe 20. At first, I told myself it had to be a grid problem, something electrical. But the timing was too exact. The lights didn't fail randomly. They went dark right before I reached each one, and the ones behind me stayed out, so the further I drove, the darker it got. It felt like I was being funneled into a tunnel of black. I pulled over under the last working lamp, shifted into park, and just sat there with the engine idling. I leaned forward on the wheel, staring at the dark line of poles stretching ahead. For a second I thought about turning around, but something about the silence behind me felt worse. That's when I noticed the stars. You know how, even in suburban areas, the sky never gets fully dark because of all the light pollution? Well, when those lamps started shutting off, the sky above got clearer. Too clear. I could see more stars than I should have from inside town. And against that backdrop, there was something. At first, I thought it was a cloud drifting across the sky, but it didn't make sense. The night was clear, not a cloud in sight. This shape was darker than the sky itself, like a cutout moving slowly against the stars. I couldn't make out edges, but it was big, bigger than anything I could wrap my head around. It covered a whole swath of stars, blotting them out as it passed. I killed the engine without even thinking, and the sudden silence pressed in. No crickets, no dogs barking, just me sitting there with my hands on the wheel, staring straight up. The shape wasn't making a sound, not like a plane, not like a helicopter. It drifted, almost lazy, but steady. And the weirdest part was how low it seemed. Not airplane high, closer, too close. Then I noticed the streetlight I was parked under starting to buzz, that soft hum bulbs make when they're about to fail. It flickered once, twice, and then snapped off, plunging me into total dark. I fumbled for the ignition and turned the headlights back on. The beams lit up the asphalt and a slice of curb, but it didn't feel like enough. I kept glancing up through the windshield, trying to keep track of that shadow against the stars. It slowed. Or maybe I just imagined it, but it felt like it had stopped above me. I gripped the wheel tighter, debating whether to floor it. That's when my radio cut out. It had been low, just background music, but suddenly there was this crackle, like static swallowing the signal. Then silence. I shut it off, switched it back on. Nothing but static. Even the display went blank. That pushed me over the edge. I dropped it into drive and hit the gas. Tires squealed louder than I meant, and I flew down that road with my headlights bouncing off the empty houses. Every pole I passed was dark, and in the rear view, there was just this endless black stretch swallowing me up. I kept checking the sky. The shape was still there, gliding along above. Not fast, not chasing, but keeping pace. It didn't wobble or tilt like a blimp, it just moved as if the sky itself was shifting with it. At the end of the street, I blew through a stop sign and turned hard onto a busier road. The sudden glare of a gas station up ahead nearly blinded me, but I was grateful for it. Bright fluorescent lights, cars parked at the pumps, people moving around, normal life. The instant I pulled under that glow, I checked the sky again. The shape was gone. Just stars, a regular summer night sky. I sat there for a while, pretending to scroll my phone, watching to see if anyone else noticed something. Nobody looked up. Nobody seemed off. After maybe 15 minutes, I finally worked up the nerve to drive the rest of the way home. I stuck to main roads with plenty of lights, passing traffic, anything that made me feel less alone. When I pulled into my driveway, the radio blinked back to life. Same station I'd had on before, same song mid-verse like nothing had happened. I never drove that neighborhood shortcut again. I was on my way home from a night shift at the plant, windows cracked because the night had that heavy late July warmth that stuck to your skin. The route I take is the old county road. 2 lanes, trees crowding the shoulders, spaced out farms, the kind of place where headlights from oncoming cars show up like campfires and then are gone. I knew the stretch. I'd driven it hundreds of times. I should have been thinking about nothing, just counting mile markers. But my brain kept poking at the hum of the fluorescent lights in my head from the last 12 hours and the coffee in the cup holder. About 10 minutes out, I saw taillights up ahead, 2 red dots down the road. Easy enough, someone going my speed. I eased into the left lane, planning to pass once the road straightened. That's when I noticed they were oddly far apart. Not the usual twin lamps on a bumper. These were like 2 separate points stretched so wide that it looked like they belonged to 2 different vehicles riding in tandem with a huge gap of empty road between them. For a second, I thought someone had a trailer back there with blinkers, or there were 2 bicyclists carrying red lights. But on that part of the country road, you'd see reflectors or wooden posts, something to account for spacing. I kept my distance and watched. In the mirror, the dots didn't waver. They kept the same separation and the same speed. I went to the left a little to pass, and the pair stayed exactly where they were on the road, not gaining, not falling back. It had the feel of something deliberate, like my brain kept nudging me to make sense and my eyes refused. I eased off and fell back, told myself to be patient. A mile later, the radio started to act up. I keep the dial on a local AM talker, late night callers and fishing reports, but the signal cut and the display did that stupid little scan where it jumps through static and lands on other bands. It kept drifting between stations, playing snippets of commercials and then slipping into static. I fiddled with the knob. The noise was a thin, skittering thing that crawled under the skin. It stopped for a breath, then started up again. For a second, the voice on the speaker came through like it belonged to someone standing in the bed of the truck. Not in the cab. Close enough, I felt like I could hear teeth on syllables. Then the voice went away and the radio did that sudden blank where it was just hiss. Traffic out here is sparse at that hour. There was a farmhouse 2 miles back, a single porch light burning. I watched that little square through the trees and the light seemed steady, but then it flickered like a candle. A dog barked somewhere down a lane and stopped mid-yelp as if pulled on a string. The silence after that bark hit me the way a cold draft hits an open window. Unexpected and unaccounted for. I told myself the power was acting up on someone's generator, that the dog could have been startled by something much smaller than whatever the night wanted me to think about. When the taillights came into my rear view again, I had let myself pass them and then circled back because the spacing had knotted in the back of my skull. They were still the same impossible distance apart. I caught myself laughing quietly at the cadence of my own nervousness, at the tiny loop of logic that had me doing 2 passes in the span of a few minutes. It was absurd. 2 red dots where one should be, steady like beacons. I gave it a little throttle. The pickup ate the acceleration, tires chewing gravel at the edges of the asphalt, and the taillights ahead, which had been oddly complacent, seemed to stretch further away for a moment like a rubber band. I was closing in. All I had to do was line up, signal, and pass when the road flattened. Then the lights did something I didn't have a name for. They moved, not in the way a car moves, they rose. The 2 points straightened up, lifted off the surface of the road in perfect unison, and instead of growing smaller like something receding, they simply translated upward until they were hung over the trees. Still separate, still the same distance apart, now floating like 2 red lanterns. For a breath, the world narrowed to the red glow and the road. No wind, no sound of engines, nothing mechanical. The radio went dead all the way, the hiss cutting to nothing. It felt like the night held its hand over everything. I hit the brakes and the truck rocked against the emergency without wanting to. Instinct said, get out, get closer, find something rational. Instinct and physiology argued. I wanted to be part of the scene, to park properly and walk up like a neighbor with questions. But the part of me that's supposed to be sensible sat in the cab and watched my own hands on the wheel. The lights hung there maybe 3 seconds. long enough to make the back of my neck tight, long enough for me to check the mirrors again and see nothing behind me. Two red dots suspended above the pines where no one should have lights. No silhouette of a vehicle. No string from some prankster's drone. There was an odd soft halo around each light, like a small mist had gathered at their edges, but the air looked the same otherwise. When they blinked out, it wasn't a fade. 1 second they set the sky into two little panels of red, the next there was only stars and the dark shape of the tree line. The radio came back on like someone had hit play. The AM talker resumed mid-sentence as if nothing had interrupted. I snapped the truck back into drive because an anxiety I couldn't name made me want to move. The engine hummed, tires grabbed, and the road unfolded ahead. The porch light I'd looked at earlier was steady again. The dog across the lane gave one clear bark like waking up from a dream and then went about being a dog. I didn't feel relief. I felt like I had walked through the wrong room and had to convince myself the floor was the same as it had always been. For the next few miles, every mundane thing felt oddly aligned to the image of those two lights. My GPS, a little old Garmin with a cracked screen, lost signal when I passed the old mill, and then found it again a half-mile later with coordinates that put me a foot off the road on the map. A moth banged itself against the windshield and then just sat on the glass like it had been told to stop. The stoplight in the little town I rolled through blinked orange and then returned to green, like a machine that had checked itself. People in a parking lot kept to the normal routines. Cigarette light, engine idle, laughter over something forgettable. Nothing announced the thing I'd seen. I got home safe. I always go the long way the night after something unsettles me. Bright lights, a loud noise, a moment that makes me feel watched. Because the long way lets you see what you already know in daylight, and daylight is its own kind of explanation. The house was quiet except for the refrigerator and the soft fan of the computer I leave on for the security camera. I booted up the laptop because idiots on the internet sometimes catch things on dash cams or door cams. The porch camera had a 3-minute gap in its recording, in the tail end of the hour I'd been on the road. The clip before the gap showed the county road empty, after the gap the same, as if a film splice had removed a beat. I replayed the part of my drive where the lights rose over and over in my head instead of on footage. My hands were still a little shaky when I put my cup in the sink. My wife was already asleep. I didn't wake her. There's something unhelpful about waking someone to tell them the sky did something you can't explain. It either becomes a late-night story that grows, or it becomes the thing you both put away. I left it in the dark corners of my head. Later, a hand at the office asked me casually if I'd seen the weird lights on my route. Someone else had called dispatch. They'd had a report from a farmer about 2 red lights over his field around midnight. Word spread the next day and then contracted, like a bruise fading. Someone suggested it was a pair of cheap fireworks shot badly. Another swore it looked like a couple of lanterns on a wire. I heard talk of drones, of pranksters, of thyroids, and imagination. I drove that road again the week after, daytime, nails biting into the steering wheel when a deer stepped off the shoulder and then trotted away like a normal animal. The trees looked ordinary in the cutting light. The farmer's field was quiet and planted. My porch camera showed only the usual: moths, a raccoon, the sweep of headlights when the mail truck passed. No frame showed 2 red dots lifting like lanterns and vanishing above the pines. The world sold itself back to me in rational increments. Every so often since then, when I'm on a night shift and the highway is an open ribbon and the radio starts to do that little scan again, I find my eyes drifting to the rear view. I check for twin dots and for impossible spacing and for things rising quiet as breath. Mostly there's only the normal blink of taillights, the comforting 2-beat rhythm of a day that keeps to its ordinary rules. Sometimes, in the exact place where the road makes that long, soft curve, I slow down for no reason at all, and I watch the trees like someone who's paid careful attention to a single detail and learn to be a little less certain about how much of the world can be explained by light and shadow. I was alone in the little aluminum skiff when the water started to glow. It was the kind of evening that wants to be ordinary. Late August, the sun had slipped under the pines, and the lake had the slow, even breath of dusk. I'd been out for hours with a rod balanced on my knee and a thermos of bad coffee at my feet. The bugs were finally giving me a break, and the only sounds were the gentle slap of the water and the occasional distant call of a loon. I had the lantern low and the engine off, just sitting there, waiting for a bite. At first, I thought the glow was a reflection. A truck light from the road, a flashlight, someone on the opposite shore, something conventional. It appeared as a pale greenish white that seemed to come from under the surface and spread out in a neat circle, maybe 12-15 feet across. The water in that patch wasn't choppy or different color. It was as smooth as the rest of the lake. But the light softened the reeds nearby, made the underside of the dock planks show like a photograph. I watched it for a long time, and it didn't move. It just sat there beneath the surface, like a lamp someone had set on the lake bed. Before the patch lit, there were small oddities. Nothing dramatic, little things that I tucked away and tried not to make a story of. My radio, the old handheld I use for weather and to chatter with the guys at the bait shop, had been acting up all afternoon. It would snap to static and then back to the same country station I always listened to. Around dusk, the display flashed nonsense for a second and then went blank. I tightened my grip on the rod and told myself it was just the battery and that I should stop worrying about machines. My watch flicked a minute ahead and then righted itself. My phone, which I'd left in the dry box, gave off a single chime that sounded like a message but had no notification attached. I didn't think much of any of it until later. Also, the fish were being strange, not biting, and when something did roll the surface, it wasn't one of the normal splashes. They were small, precise disturbances, like someone tapping the water with a stick. I watched a pair of minnows chase each other in a quarter circle inside of the glow, and then stop, as if whoever nudged the water had told them to. They weren't frightened, they just paused. I know that sounds small, but it felt like the world had paused with them. I leaned over the gunwale and peered into the bright circle. It had a depth to it that made my stomach tighten, like the bottom of the lake had been lit from a lamp set on the silt. There was no smoke, no bubbles, no scent, and the air above the surface was still. I looked up at the treetops to find the source. No boats, no headlamps, no people. The dark line of the shore held only the vertical teeth of pines and the occasional blinking light of a distant house. Nothing that would have thrown a light like that under the water. I fumbled for the camera on my phone. On routine nights, I take nothing but pictures of empty bobbers and bad sunsets. When I lifted the phone and pointed it toward the glow, the screen offered me nothing but a gray square where the water should have been. I thought maybe I had the lens covered, but the rest of the frame showed the bow and the thermos, and even the reflection of my own face on the wet aluminum. The glowing patch simply did not register on the sensor. I tapped the screen and switched to video and filmed for a minute, but the playback showed only a darker lake and the quick bob of my breathing. The soundtrack had a high, thin hiss under it that I hadn't heard in the silence outside. Later, when I tried to scrub the clip, the footage froze and then rendered as a blank frame for several seconds before correcting itself. Technology has quirks. I've learned that on long nights with a lot of coffee, but the timing felt like something punctual and deliberate. The glow changed next in a way nothing natural does. It rose. Not a ripple, not a spray, not a column of steam. The light peeled up out of the water like someone were lifting a silk balloon through a ring. For a breath, I thought some diver had surfaced with a lamp and was rising slowly, an old film image stuck in my head. But there was no wet surface breaching, no circle of bubbles, no sound of a wet jacket. The light rose as a small sphere, maybe the size of a beach ball, hovering a few feet above the surface, and the lake beneath it remained mirror flat. It shed no drop, made no splash. The outline of the thing, if you could call it that, was a soft rim of luminosity with a center that was almost clear, like a silhouette of brightness. When that light cleared the top of the reeds, it hovered at about chest height beside the skiff, close enough that I could have hit it with a hand if not for the absurdity of the reach. It gave off no heat. I put my fingers into the edge of the glow, and the skin of my palms felt the cool air. There was no smell, no changing pressure, nothing mechanical. June, my old Labrador at the shore earlier, used to come out with me sometimes and stare into the water. I imagined how she would have reacted, her hackles up, low hesitation, and that thought made me smile a small, brittle laugh that felt inadequate to the scene. There was stillness in that moment, like the lake had closed its eyes and the world had hushed to listen. I felt foolish and human and way too exposed. I wanted to call someone, 911, the harbor master, the guys from the bait shop who always answered at odd hours, but my voice dried in my throat. I remember thinking extremely practical things in the next seconds. Don't make sudden moves. Don't shine lights at it. Record it if you can. Then the light blinked out. It wasn't a fade. It wasn't a dim. 1 second there was this small globe of light hovering, and the next there was nothing. The water where it had been showed no disturbance. The reeds didn't bend. The minnows resumed their circuit as if the pause had been nothing more than a timeout. The radio came back to life with a station I didn't know and then righted itself when I turned it. The high hiss on the video playback cut away like someone mending a tear. The lake kept its soft breathing, and the loon called as if it had only been responding to a polite pause. I sat in the bow of the skiff with my heart loud and ridiculous, my hands sticky with bait, and watched the place where light had been. I rowed in slow. The oars dipped with the usual sound, the lake closed waves in little fingers. On the dock, the planks creaked the same as always. My neighbor Kenny was there stacking his own traps. He squinted at me as I clambered up because I looked like someone who had lost a piece of patience. "You get anything?" he asked. I opened my mouth and for a second couldn't tell whether I wanted to say the truth or let the memory sit in the waterproof box it had been born into. I told him I hadn't and left out the rest. Left out the glow, the way my fingers had felt the nothing at its edge. Kenny is the kind of man who believes what he can taste. He shrugged and said the fish have been weird and that his son's buddy had turned his compass around on the way back in. Small circles of oddness. People shrug and return to thinking about nets and gas. At home that night, the news feeds had nothing except the county fair schedule and a story about a new marina downstate. Nobody had posted anything convincing to the local online pages. A kid on one of the forums had his camera footage of a light posted, and the comment thread curled into jokes about phosphorescent algae and phone filters. I read it and closed the laptop. There are comforts in being anonymous in a place where the water is larger than the town. Sleep was a thin thing. My head kept handing me the image of the sphere, and when I closed my eyes, there was an after image, like a burned postcard of phosphor. I didn't have a clean explanation, not even one I could spit out in the bar and get a laugh or a conspiracy. I had an experience that was as precise as a needle and as indecipherable as a dream. I woke up early and checked my camera again. The files were ordinary. Sunrise gold on the water, my coffee mug ring, the rod leaning against the workbench. No frames caught anything out of the order. Days went by and life went back to its small routines. I made runs to the bait shop, fixed a loose board on the dock, fielded questions about license renewal. Sometimes I would stand at the edge of the lake at dusk and watch the place where it had happened, the water turning the color of old glass. A gull would slip by, a fish would blow a ring. The world looked the same, and yet there was a mark that felt like a bruise under my skin. I told one friend, Mike, expecting the usual phosphorescent algae, he'd say, or military flares. He listened, then said only, "Well, if it was nothing, you're the kind of person who'd see it." He didn't laugh. That, more than anything, unnerved me. Weeks later, an angler in a different town swore he'd seen lights under the water too, a story plucked from a forum and repeated like a rumor caught in driftwood. It didn't make the thing make sense. It only made the memory less solitary. I have no tidy ending for it. The glow did not return in the same spot. My phone videos offered me their blank gray honesty again when I checked them in nerves, and the radio kept its usual temperamental life. The minnows came back and the loon called. I kept going out in the skiff because that's what I do when the lake hands you a thing you can't file away. Go look at it, pay it respect, try to make a habit of the ordinary. Some nights the water will catch the moon and look like a sheet of polished nickel. and I will sit and think about the way light can come up from somewhere and be gone in a blink. I don't know what rose from that depth and hung in the air, then vanished without causing so much as a ripple. I don't know if anyone else saw it or if anyone else will. I only know how it felt to be there in the skiff with a thermos and a rod and a face full of quiet, watching a small, impossible thing float out of the lake and then watching it blink away like a rehearsal for something else. I had been up on that ridge since before first light, the way I always went when I was trying to get something done right. Name's Joe Mallory. I work construction most days, but hunting's the thing that keeps my head level. That morning was late October, the kind of morning where the air feels like someone poured cold water over the trees. There was frost on the bracken, and my breath hung in front of me in little clouds. The woods smelled like wet needles and old leaves. Everything about it should have been ordinary. I set the gun on the rest, cups of thermos coffee steaming inside my jacket, and waited. The saddle I like to sit in gives you a view down into a small hollow where deer like to cross. You can see the scrape marks and the beaten paths where they come through in the pre-dawn. I brought binoculars and a small spotting scope on a tripod because my eyes aren't what they used to be, and anyway I like to look. At first it was normal, the soft crack of a brittle twig, a jay squawking like an alarm clock, a fox yipping somewhere farther down. I settled into the rhythm, sipped coffee, checked the maples for any sign of movement. Then everything stopped. It wasn't gradual. 1 minute the ridge had a dozen small noises layered up, birds up high, the creek chattering, a distant truck starting, and the next there was nothing. No bird song, no insect hum. The creek sounded like it had been wrapped with cloth. The world got smaller inside my jacket. I became aware of my own heartbeat like it was a drum. I've been in woods my whole life, and you get used to a soundtrack. When it's gone, the absence is a thing. That small wrongness made me tighten the straps on my pack without thinking. I looked to the tree line to see if something big had stood up. A buck, a bear. But there was nothing. Even the usual white noise of forest life felt muted. My dog Scout, who had come with me and was curled under the truck's tailgate, lifted his head and didn't move. He's a mutt, mostly indifferent, but his ears were up and fixed. I told myself not to be silly. Animals go quiet sometimes. The cold will hush them. So I told myself the usual stories and kept watching. I checked my phone because I do that out of habit to see the time and the weather, and the screen was a little odd. No bars, just the little spinning wheel for a second. Then the home screen came up and the clock read 12 minutes ahead of what I knew it should be. I looked back at the scope and then down at my watch, the old analog one my dad gave me, and it was right. The phone flashed back to correct time after a blink. It could have been a glitch. Batteries get flaky in the cold. I shoved the phone into my pocket and told myself to pay attention. The animal quiet held. Scout kept his head down but stayed alert. No deer came out into the hollow. The wind was a dead calm. The usual tell, I swear this is true, was that the jays would start up again first, all nervous and talkative. They didn't. The silence sat on the branches. After a long minute, I raised the scope. It's something you do when there's nothing to do. You look closer and give your eyes something to find. The scope smelled faintly of lens cleaner and metal. I made sure the tripod ran steady and put my eye to the eyepiece. The reticle came up on the far ridge where the maples thin out. That's when I saw it. At first it read in my brain as something natural, because you want the world to be ordinary. A shape catching the pale morning. A reflection, maybe. But it didn't fit anything I knew. It hung just below the top of a line of spruce, maybe 20-25 feet off the ground. It had an edge to it that made the trees behind it look wrong in comparison. The edges were too clean. The surface was smooth and dull, like weathered metal, not shiny but not dull earth either. It had a seam or a feint running around it, not round like a rock, flat planes meeting at an angle. I thought of someone building some art piece out there. Kids these days do weird things, but nothing in the valley suggested people. No tracks, no lights. It hovered. That's the only word for it. It didn't hang from a wire. Nothing in the trees moved where a wire would have tugged. It simply sat at that height and made the space around it feel compressed. My hands got tight on the scope. Hunters develop tendencies, ways to keep your breathing steady, how to count the seconds between breaths, so you can be steady if something walks into view. I adjusted the focus, expecting the lens to sharpen the object into something sensible, a blown-out piece of tin or the back of an old satellite dish someone left. The focus knob turned the way it always did, but the glass didn't settle. The edges of the shape blurred and then sharpened. The object's planes, if that's what they were, seemed to rearrange themselves like it ducked slightly out of the focal plane. When I tightened the focus one more time to lock it in, it was gone. Just gone. Not falling, not swinging away. One frame in the scope, and the next a blank of spruce and frost. My pulse spiked like I'd been slapped. I moved the scope side to side and panned up and down, feeling stupid. Cameras and scopes sometimes glitch. You get a floaty focus issue and the world plays tricks on you. But when I panned, the ground was empty. My breath fogged in the scope. The woods sounded like themselves again. Tiny noses of wind in the needles, a distant crow calling the way crows do, like they had returned on cue. For a while I stood there, feeling the sound settle around me. Scout nosed my hand like he had been asleep the whole time. I took the rifle down off the rest and clapped my gloves together because I wanted a sound that belonged to me to assert itself. I walked the ridge line slowly, boots crushing the frost into stars, looking for anything that would explain where the object had been. A piece of foil, a kite, something someone had thrown. Nothing. No lens, no wire, no canvas caught in the scrub. The bracken was unbroken, the moss smooth. When I got back to the saddle, I saw the leaves, on the exact patch in front of me, were flattened, lay the opposite of the usual way. Not trampled like someone had stood, more like someone had pressed them down from above and then lifted. It made my neck go prickly. I took a picture with my phone of the flattened leaves and the ridge behind them. The camera didn't show what I had seen. The photo was the ordinary world: leaves, frost, sky. I put the phone away because I couldn't make it prove the thing had been there. I sat down again and tried to make sense. Hunters get mistaken. You learn to laugh about it. You tell the tale a week later with embellishment, and the world gets cozy around the edges. But there were other small things that morning that didn't fit the laughable box. The cheap thermos cap under my elbow was cracked open, though I hadn't opened it. The little GPS I had clipped to my belt blinked in a pattern for a few seconds, like it was searching, and then showed a weird coordinate that was a few meters off the trail. When I reset it, it behaved fine. A truck passed on the dirt road, and the driver never looked up. He didn't seem to notice anything odd. If something extraordinary happens, the world seldom pauses for you. That's one of the rules. I left the ridge earlier than I'd planned, not because I felt outright scared. There's a difference between being afraid and being unsettled, but because the quiet had that sticky feeling that doesn't go away. Scout hopped into the truck and gave me a look like he approved of the plan. I drove down the logging road with the window cracked, listening to the engine like it was a reassurance. At the feed store, I ran into Hank, who watched me wipe mud off my boots like we were having the same small conversation without words. I told him I'd seen something odd on the ridge. Metal? He asked. He always gets to the core quick, like he's been around weird things before. I told him what I'd seen and what I hadn't found. He frowned and said, "You sure?" "No," I said, "and yes." That was the only honest way to put it. Hank nodded slowly like it made sense and handed me a bag of kernels. "You ever report it?" he asked. "To who?" I said. The sheriff would smile politely, put it in a log, file it under natural oddities, or he'd ask if I'd been drinking, or he'd shrug because there's not much they can do and life is full of loose ends. I spent the rest of the day looking for an explanation that would fit a neat box. I asked hunters in the feed store if anyone had lost a tarp or hung anything out as a prank. People shrugged. Some swore they'd heard of lights over in the next county. Someone muttered about military exercises. Another said he'd had his watch go a minute off the same morning. Small anomalies lined up like pennies you can pick up if you try, but none of them made sense of the smooth edge I'd seen in the scope. That night, I didn't sleep well. Not because I expected it to come back, but because the morning had left an itch behind my ribs. I thought of setting the scope out on the porch like some kind of test, but the thought of being out there at first light felt heavier now. Instead, I cleaned the rifle, tightened the scope mounts, checked the tripod, told myself the mundane things. Guns get jammed, lenses get fogged, the mind fills blanks, and went to bed. You get to learn a lot about yourself when the woods hand you a thing you can't box. The ordinary parts of my day, the truck, the feed store, the route of a fence line, reclaim their places by dinner. But the memory sits in the part of me that notices things that don't add up. Every time I get up on that ridge now, I check the corners a beat longer. And when the birds fall quiet, I don't tell myself it's only the weather. I tighten the focus slowly and hold my breath. If I ever see it again, I'll try the camera. Or not. Maybe proof would only make the thing smaller. For now, I live with the record in my head. The hush, the metal, the vanish the moment I tried to fix it with glass. I was on the ridge before dawn because that's when the deer usually moved and because the thermometer read 9 degrees. And I figured the cold would keep the bugs down. I drove the dirt road in my old pickup until it got too rutted, hiked the last half mile with my pack, and climbed into the natural saddle where I like to sit. The sun was only a pale wash on the eastern horizon, and there was frost on the branches that made the pines look like they'd been dusted with flour. I set the tripod, scoped my rifle out of habit, and sat with my elbows on my knees. My name's Mark Lawson. I live about 20 minutes from that ridge, and I've hunted these woods since I was a kid. I know the sounds they make, the soft rattle of squirrel claws, the swoop of a jay, the breath of wind through the firs. That morning it felt like every one of those sounds had been turned down to nothing. At first I thought the quiet was just the cold. Cold makes the world soft, but you still hear things, your own boots, a twig breaking under a deer's foot. Around 45 minutes in, I noticed there was no bird song at all. Not the high, thin whistle of the chickadees, not the rasp of a woodpecker. I scanned the ridge with binoculars and saw nothing moving, just trees with ice on their needles and a thin mist in the valley. The place felt empty in a way that made your neck prick. I pulled the scope up and adjusted to the range I'd guessed. The deer were usually on the far shoulder around 70 yards. The reticle read steady, the crosshairs lined up, and I cupped my cheek against the stock. My heartbeat was normal. The way it is when you're bored and cold and trying to be patient. The silence continued. It was a heavy quiet, not peaceful. It made the breath in my lungs sound like it was stolen. A cousin of mine, Dean, would have joked about owls. He said owls switched the soundtrack of the woods when they wanted to talk. I thought that joke as a reflex and then stopped because jokes don't make the air feel thinner. Before anything obvious happened, there were smaller things that didn't line up. My phone, which usually had one little bar up there at the ridge, dropped to no service for a minute and showed me the last text timestamp from 2 minutes earlier. I thought it was a battery quirk, but then my watch, a cheap thing with a rubber band, blinked and reset itself a minute forward before settling. The thermos lid rattled even though I'd tightened it an inch earlier. Tiny things all at once, like someone had shuffled the deck. I saw movement to my left, caught on the periphery of the scope. At first, my brain gave it the easy answers: squirrel, jay, deer. I shifted the rifle toward it and leaned out of the hollow under my jacket. The scope made the world honest. When I put my eye up and focused, I found a shape hovering just below the upper canopy, maybe 30 feet off the ground. It was the wrong color for a bird, more metallic than feathered, and it didn't have wings in the way anything around here did. My first reaction was annoyance. Hunters see things in odd light all the time and later laugh about the mystery squirrel. But this was something I couldn't tuck away. It hung there like a polished coin, dull silver, reflecting nothing in particular. The light around it was flat, early morning gloom, and this thing took that gloom and made an edge where there wasn't one. It wasn't shiny so much as it was a flat metallic tone that made the edges look too straight against the irregular tree line. The scope's autofocus tried to hunt and then refused, like the lens was indecisive about the object's distance. I thought, weird, and adjusted the focus ring. When I first saw it, I thought maybe it was dangling from a wire. There were tree-to-tree lines around here, old fence wire, survey flags. but nothing looked like it could hold a weight in midair like that. Whatever it was, it didn't bob. It didn't hang. It held its position like something else was holding the world back from moving. I kept the crosshairs steady and watched. The thing moved, but not in the way a bird or a drone would. It slid a few degrees left, then right, then up in a soft, precise way as if someone off-camera nudged it. The scope's glass made it larger, meaner. I could see seams, thin lines across its length like plate joins on a roof. No lights, no propellers, no smoke, no sound. With a normal target, you get little cues. A deer shifts weight, a bird shudders its wings. There were none of those cues. The weird exhalation came in stages. First, my scalp tightened, a physical sensation like you get when thunder shivers through the valley, except there was no storm. The dogs 2 farms over did not start howling. The cattle in a distant pasture that normally mooed sometime around daybreak were silent. The whole world seemed to be watching with me. I felt separated from everything the way you do when you fall asleep and something small snaps you awake, present and confused all at once. I tightened my grip and adjusted the focus again because the thing softened at the edges like I was looking through fog. I think I said out loud, "What the hell?" I wasn't being dramatic. My voice just came out because I needed a human sound to keep me grounded. The moment the words left my mouth, the object vanished. It did not move away. It did not fall. It was simply gone from the scope. One blink and the reticle saw nothing but the dark trunks and a scatter of frost on low bushes. There was no drop or smear of motion. 1 second there was a metallic presence, and the next there was an absence the mind wanted to fill with noise. I took the rifle off the rest and sat back, the sound of my breath too loud. For a full minute, I kept pinging the scope back and forth over the tree line, like scanning in little arcs where it might have gone. Nothing. No helicopter sound, no flashlight beams, not even the nervous flapping of a bird. The temperature on my fingers had dropped a degree, and my watch was back on time. Small things unraveled. The tree line looked the same as it always did. I climbed down and walked the ridge the way hunters do when they need to convince themselves they aren't crazy. Slowly, head on a swivel, boots folding sound into the dead grass. No tracks, no wires, no reflective fabric caught in branches. The frost had no shoe prints, nothing out of the ordinary. I felt like I was erasing myself as I moved, a steady pressure of being the only living thing who had looked in that place and seen something impossible. By the time I made it down the logging road to my truck, the sun had cleared a finger of the horizon and the birds came back like a released order. A jay called, then a woodpecker. Clattered. Sound returned as if someone had turned it back on. My phone reclaimed 1 bar. The truck's engine warmed. I sat in the cab with my hands on the steering wheel and tried to find routine. I could have driven back into town, rung the sheriff, told someone. I didn't. I told myself I'd been vision tired, that the cold and the half-awake state made my eyes play at meaning. That was a reasonable lie. The best lies feel normal. At the diner in town, I ordered coffee that tasted like burnt paper and talked to Gus, the mechanic who fixes my truck. He laughed when I said the woods were quiet and asked if I'd seen a moose. I said no. I didn't tell him about the metal. He asked if I'd been out late last night, swallowed something, anything. I said no again and changed the subject to deer population and rut timing, mundane talk to smooth the edges. The day kept tossing other small oddities at me. My email timestamps showed a message received 20 minutes in the future, then corrected itself an hour later. One of the main roads had a temporary power flicker that didn't affect the rest of town. A kid at the feed store told a story about his dad's flashlight failing in the middle of a hunt, then cutting back on just the battery being loose. I could line them up and make a neat, boring parade out of them, or I could see them as the same loose thread. I chose the boring parade because it fit better with being back in a life that pays the bills and cuts wood. That evening, I went back up the ridge because that's what you do. You check your sight lines, you prove to yourself you didn't dream it. I sat where I had sat that morning and waited until the stars came out. The air had the same bite, the trees the same silhouettes. I watched the tree line, scope on rest, nothing moving. I kept waiting for a repeat, as if whatever I had seen had a pattern or a courtesy about it. Nothing came. The next morning, I told my sister about it, careful, even then, with my words. She listened and said, "Maybe you saw a drone." Maybe. A word that boxes the thing up and hands it back to a rational world. I liked that answer more than I did on the ridge, less when I lay awake thinking about seams and edges and the way it disappeared when I focused on it. People I spoke to later had their own small things. An old man at the hardware store swore his watch lost time for an hour while he stood at his sink. A lady on the next road over said her crows were unusually quiet for a day. Lots of coincidences make a map. Maps make patterns. Patterns want an origin. I didn't take a photograph. When I thought of it, I felt ridiculous even in that memory. The camera phone in my pocket would have shown a gray rectangle or the trees and nothing more, and I would have brought proof that was useless. I kept the rifle clean, tightened the scope mounts, and slept with the window cracked a thumb. The woods remain the woods, indifferent and large. The memory of the metallic shape sits in the part of me that keeps logs. The ridge, the frost, the silence, the focus, the vanish. It was precise, quiet, and impossible to reconcile with the rest of the world. I hunt in those woods every season. Sometimes you see tracks and sometimes you don't. You set your sights and you wait. You learn to live with things you can't explain, because life in the country tends to hand you oddness without warning. That week, the woods were quiet more than they were noisy. I still go back and sit in the saddle at dawn. I still bring the scope up. My eye tests the glass and finds the world true and stubborn and often ordinary. Occasionally, when the wind dies and the birds are late to start, I will look along the tree line and hold my breath, half hoping to prove myself wrong, half wanting to know if whatever it was will ever come back and allow me to watch it vanish again. I had the scope out on the roof by 9:12, which felt ridiculously precise even to me. I set the tripod, balanced the finder, and let the Dobsonian settle while the neighborhood traded the last of the car alarms for quiet. It was one of those late August nights where the air had finally thinned out and the sky went entire. No clouds, no haze, everything pin sharp. I liked nights like that. The stars felt like real things you could almost touch. My name's Ethan Morales. I'm not a scientist, just a web developer who fumbles with star charts and shows up to public viewing nights at the community college because I like other people's telescopes. I'd been tracing Saturn's rings for the better part of the evening, turning the knob in small, satisfied movements. At some point, the neighborhood noise dropped to nothing, the kind of hush that lets you hear a neighbor's fridge cycle 2 houses over. That was the first odd thing, not dramatic, but noticeable. The air felt tuned. I switched eyepieces and drifted to a patch of sky near Altair where a friend had told me there might be some satellite passes. I like picking a spot like that, something mildly promising but not too showy, so when weird stuff happens, it has room to sneak up on you. I found a faint little point and put the red dot on it. It danced. Not the gentle, steady creep of most satellites. It arced left, snapped right, reversed, then shot a short sideways line like someone jerked a string. I blinked and adjusted the focus. The scope is a glassed-in truth machine. If something moves there, it proves it's there. This moved in ways tiny motors and my clumsy hands didn't. I expected to see it with my naked eye when I peered up. Sometimes you can catch a bright satellite or a plane, but the sky was the sky. Nothing where the scope was pointing. That alone should have grounded me. It didn't. I told myself it was an optical quirk, seeing movement in peripheral after images from the contrast in the eyepiece. I've explained things to myself before to make them less alarming. Tonight the self-talk didn't stick. I tracked the point for a few minutes. It darted like a fly with a plan, folding its path back on itself, then leaping to a new place a fraction of a degree away and holding like nothing had happened. Every maneuver made that little human shiver of excitement, the good kind, like finding a comet. But excitement curdled into mild unease when the object stopped in the scope and my digital clock on the rail went blank for a beat. The battery icon on my phone jigged. I glanced at the roofline to see if the neighbor had turned on a floodlight. Nothing changed. The scope's optics showed the thing against the fixed background of stars, but the world around me had a few quiet wrong notes. A jay gave a single harsh roll and then the birds went quiet. Not all at once like a cue, but enough of the species to make the moment feel arranged. That made me look up straight out of the eyepiece. My eyes took in that slice of the sky like someone who went to the fridge and found the light off. Nothing. No moving star, no contrail, no blinking plane. I went back to the eyepiece. The point in the viewfinder had moved, twitched again, then vanished for an instant and reappeared to the right like a blink. I set the scope down enough to take a video longer than my shaky hand would produce and keep the thing documented. The phone recorded a small white blur against sky. Playback later showed only the smear of a star and a gusty wind in the trees. The audio was a thin hiss that wasn't there when I listened live. Technology not helping you is a kind of loneliness all its own. The next unsettling cluster of things stacked up the way uncomfortable truths often do, each small and explainable alone, together heavier. My analog watch ticked ahead 5 minutes against the digital tower clock I keep on my dashboard. My neighbor's dog, usually a yappy thing, lay flat and watchful on their stoop, ears forward like a sentry. 3 streetlights down on Willow, one of the bulbs went out in that long, slow blink that older lamps do just before they die. The blot in the sky didn't affect any of those things directly, but everything felt like it was tuned to the same unusual station. Back at the scope, the object was doing patterns I'd never seen a satellite do. It would track sideways, be motionless for several seconds, and then perform a movement that looked almost impossible, switching direction full stop and relocating along a curve that suggested acceleration beyond anything in low Earth orbit, then slowing to a hover as if to show off. When something in a telescope behaves like that, you try to be precise about your observation. I scribbled times on a notepad, noting coordinates, a habit I'd picked up at star parties. The notes didn't help. They only proved I'd been recording myself being human. Around midnight, a faint orange glow appeared over the eastern tree line. Not bright, not a city smudge, just the suggestion of someone lighting a lantern far away. It would have been normal if it were a farmer checking a fence. I glanced up the hill toward the glow, and when I looked back through the eyepiece, the target had zipped in a sawtooth path and paused like it was listening. When you spend long nights alone cataloging the skies, you start to learn a language of patterns. This one didn't belong to anything I recognized. I thought of waking my friend Mark, who keeps a modest array of gear and always had a calm voice. I texted him 3 times. The bubble showed delivered once, but no reply came. Later, he told me his phone had been on silent and his daughter had woken up, fussing. That was the only ordinary answer in the chain, and I grabbed onto it like a lifeline, even though it didn't explain anything at all. At roughly 12:27, I watched the point vanish in the eyepiece again, and when it was gone, the roof answered. The hum from the AC units across the street cut off like someone had pinched the power line. The streetlights dimmed together for almost a full second. The kind of staggered electrical hiccup that usually makes you go inside and slam a circuit breaker. I sat very still and counted the seconds. After the pause, everything came back, but some part of the night had shifted. The air felt sharper like a photograph you could step into. The object reappeared after that pause, but now its path felt deliberate in a way that made me uneasy. It began to sketch small geometric shapes. A tight triangle, then a rectangle stretched into a very gentle ellipse, returning to a central point as if drawing diagrams in the sky. The maneuvers were smooth and predatory in their economy, no wasted motion. Every time I jotted down a shape, it was as though the object read the line and completed it. When you're alone on a roof at night, except for stars and the faint glow of a neighbor's television, it's easy to imagine anything. But the movements were precise enough that imagination felt like a cheap excuse. At one point, the object made a vertical dash, and I swore I saw a second point blink into existence following it, only to melt away in the eyepiece. My hands had started to tremble for no good reason. I took deep breaths and tried to apply the rules of observation. Note, record, wait. Waiting felt dangerous, like a living thing could change its mind while you weren't watching properly. Several times I angled the scope and then jerked back to look with naked eyes. The way my brain translated distance and brightness is trained by habit. If it's bright enough to move in the telescope, it should be at least a star to the naked retina. There was never anything there when I looked without the instrument. That was the part that began to gnaw. The glass gave me a reality my eyes wouldn't accept on their own. It felt like someone offering you a photograph of a thing and insisting it was in the room. After 3 hours of this, my breath smelled of cheap coffee, and my joints complained. I should have gone inside, slept, and told myself the next morning I'd been tired. Instead, the object started to loop larger patterns, slow now, almost contemplative. It traced a wide arc, paused, and then blinked in the eyepiece as if someone had flicked a light off. At that same instant, my phone went dead, completely black. Not a low battery warning, just dark. The clock on the dashboard in my car stalled at 3:02 for a moment and then resumed like it had been told to forget a beat. These coincidences pile until they look like a pattern. I didn't panic in a dramatic way. Panic is loud and messy. What I felt was quieter, a tightening in my chest, the intrusive thought that the thing might have had no need for me observing it, except that it was being observed. That's a stupid thought to have. You can probably see it for what it is. I know how the mind fills in narrative to avoid the sticky unknown. But there I was, roof perch, scope in my lap, looking into a dark that congressed around a tiny, unreasonable mover. Finally, at 3:37, the object performed something simple. It rose in the eyepiece in a straight line and then stopped. I lifted my head fully to look with my own two eyes, because part of me wanted to prove I could see it without the glass. The sky was bare. It was as if a glyph had been erased. The silence weight shifted. The neighbor's HVAC hummed back to life, and my phone lit with a notification trail of 3 texts from Mark. Short and mundane. Are you up? You okay? Call me when you can. I packed the eyepiece into its velvet bag, slid the dust cover on, and climbed down off the roof, careful and sudden in the way you are when you feel watched by something absent. I didn't tell anyone that night, not because I was embarrassed, but because the language to describe what I'd seen felt clumsy. What would I say? I saw something through a telescope that performed impossible moves and then wasn't there when I looked up. It would sound like the sort of thing you tell to a campfire full of beer and someone laughs and passes another bottle. I drove the long way home, my headlights a private tunnel, the world ordinary in the orange wash of street lamps. Every so often I'd glance up. The sky was full and innocent and unconcerned. The next day, Mark came by and we sat 3 feet apart at my kitchen table with mugs and plates barely touched. He was steady in the way friends are when they have the muscles to hold a thing for you without trying to fix it. People will suggest satellites, drones, hallucinations, strange atmospheric refraction. I can't say any of that tidily makes sense of the way the little point in the scope moved like a creature with intent, nor why my unaided eyes saw nothing when the telescope did. I've learned to live with that notch of not knowing. I still set the scope out when the sky is clear. I keep a notepad by the tripod, and sometimes late, when the neighborhood is asleep and the world has gone thin and serious, I look through the eyepiece and wait to see what decides to show up for an audience. The train lurched and stopped between stations like it had run out of patience. I remember being halfway through my commute home, earbuds in but the volume low so I could still hear the overhead announcements. My name's Aaron Kim. I work in the marketing department at a small firm, which mostly means I stare at spreadsheets until someone emails me about a logo. That night the carriage was half full. People with briefcases, a kid still in a soccer jacket, an elderly woman with a knitting bag. It had been raining, that late winter rain that smells like wet metal, and the windows had fogged at the edges. We left Central on time, the usual crawl out past the river. Then the conductor's voice said something about a signal issue ahead and to expect some delays. Delay announcements are papering over normality. I nodded to myself and went back to the podcast. A few minutes later, there was a soft, unfamiliar crackle in the intercom. The PA made that little grating noise like a radio with a bad antenna, and the conductor's voice came through thin and far off. Folks, we're holding short of, and the rest was swallowed in static. Someone in the carriage laughed, the kind of nervous snort people make, and a woman near the door muttered, "Phone's dead." She tapped her screen and it scrolled through that hollow wheel before the signal bar blinked out entirely. If the station people had told me anything useful about being stranded, I don't remember. Mostly what I remember is the little buildup of wrongness before the big break. The radio's odd crackle, phones dropping to no service at once, the lights in the carriage dimming and coming back like a breath. The conductor came by with a lantern, the old red kind they keep for power failures, and his hand trembled a bit when he gripped the rail. He was the type of guy who had worked mornings and nights for years and used to telling worried commuters everything would be sorted. That night he said he'd radio control, then stopped and said, "Control's not pulling us up on the screen. Might be a transformer or local outage." He said it calm like protocol would fix it. People pulled their coats tighter. We were in the bit of track that runs out past the old freight yards, where the catenaries hum across the sky and the only lights are infrequent signal lamps and the occasional farmhouse in the distance. The rain had stopped, but a fresh mist hung low, and the sorts of small sounds that normally live under the train, the rattle of joints, a distant engine, had thinned. A dog on one of the farms started to bark and then stopped like someone had strangled the sound. That silence grabbed me more than the stop itself. The carriage filled with muttered complaints, phones, deadlines, kids who wanted home, and in the middle of that, the darkness came. All the lights in our carriage blinked once and then went out. Not blackout black. The emergency strips along the floor glowed a weak green, and a handful of phone screens threw shards of light that made everyone's faces look strange. The conductor's lantern cast a small orange pocket, and people shifted to see the outside. Rain beads on the glass glittered like something ridiculous, like stars. You notice small things when you're forced to look out rather than down at email. The overhead lines were glassy ribbons against a raw sky. The signal posts glowed their sleepy reds and greens in the fog. Then the strangest thing happened. A pale light appeared over the tracks about 2 carriage lengths ahead, hovering maybe 20 feet above the rails. Not a beam from a helicopter or the sharp white of a car's headlights, more like the belly of a jellyfish made of light. It moved slowly, in no hurry, and there was no sound. None. The only thing that reached us was this quiet, and if quiet can feel heavy, it did. People pressed to the windows. The kid in the soccer jacket had his face mashed to the glass, breath fogging it. The elderly woman had stopped knitting. Someone whispered, "Helicopter?" But no copters come this low without a roar. My chest did that stupid tight thing when you realize you're in a place where the rules you've learned might not apply. Someone tried his cell again. The bars did nothing. The conductor's radio hissed like static and then, miraculously, blinked and wrote back. "We're showing nothing on radar." Control said that with a voice that sounded like it had been flattened under a heavy blanket. No radar returns, no aircraft traffic, nothing. The light drifted. It didn't swing or skip like a drone. It translated above the track as if the air itself were a conveyor. Up and forward, slow enough that you could swear it was a lantern tied to a balloon. I had my phone out because habit is reflex, not bravery. I recorded for 20 seconds, though I had this ridiculous feeling that the phone would betray me. The video looked like a smear through a fogged window, a bright oval that didn't behave when I zoomed in. When I played the clip back right there in the carriage, it stuttered into static at the exact second the light moved behind a signal gantry. The woman beside me said her phone had been fine, and then later swore the footage on hers had nothing but a dark frame where the light had been. What's unnamed memory is made of are the tiny mismatches you collect after something odd. The heater in the carriage that usually thrummed and blew a soft, warm breath went still. The electronic timetable by the door stopped mid-second, and then flicked to a nonsense glyph for one blink. A watch on a man across the aisle jumped forward 6 minutes and then righted itself. The dog 2 farms over resumed barking as if nothing had interrupted it, but the sound was late, lagging like a radio signal. People started talking, but their sentences broke and restarted. The conversation made islands and then sank. The whole thing felt like a film reel someone had slowed and watched frame by frame. I remember thinking that if anything like this ever ends with a rational explanation, it'll be an electrical fault, some late-night experiment, a misfired flare. None of those things were near enough to make sense. Then, as calmly as it had drifted in, the light vanished. Not ascended, not receded, just gone. It blinked out between two signal posts, and the sky swallowed the space where it had been. The carriage filled with a sound people make when they exhale together after holding their breath. Small disappointments, nervous laughs, some people saying, "Well, that was," and not finishing. The conductor got on the speaker with a voice a gear thinner than before and said, "We're going to wait a bit longer. Engineers are en route." People shifted, made makeshift plans, and someone asked if anyone had seen what it looked like. A man 2 rows down swore he'd heard a tone, a single low thing under the notes of the carriage, and that his fillings tingled. A woman said the light had had edges like oil on water. A kid said it looked like a ghost in a lamp. No one asked the obvious things out loud. Was it watching us? Was it trying to get our attention? That's the way discomfort works. You throw up smaller questions like life preservers and avoid the ones you can't hold. After what felt like forever and was probably 30 minutes, another train's lights appeared in the distance on the opposite track. That was the first purely ordinary thing all night. The approach of headlights and the dull whip of an engine. For a second we all exhaled because the world had something familiar on the horizon. The other train passed slow on the far line, conductor nodding and raising a hand, and the passengers looked like us. Faces lit by phone screens, eyes trying to hold on to stories. As it went by, someone on that train stood and pointed to our side, as if they'd seen our light too. Their conductor tapped something, and the other train did a slow, radioed roll toward the next control. We listened hard for comm chatter that would explain the event. There was none. Control finally patched a voice back through for real. Not flat this time, and the message was simple. Signal power issue, switching to local, expect movement in 10. Mechanical language. It reduced what had happened to a line item. I sat back and tried to fit together the last hour in a way that looked like a sensible map. You rehearse those maps after weird events because maps are comfort. They say there is order. When the power came back, lights snapping on in that paper flat way, the carriage cheered like a small, embarrassed audience. The conductor clapped his hands and laughed, a quick fizz of relief. The train moved, the rails sighed, and we rolled into the next station slow. People checked their phones, and the signal bars returned like an apology. Some playback that had been corrupted at the time now showed a little white smear, and then clean air. Others had nothing. The kid with the soccer jacket grinned at having a story. The elderly woman picked up her knitting again like she'd been interrupted by a neighbor. I got home late. My street was quiet, the winter air still smelling of rain and the neighbor's wood smoke. My wife was awake and sat at the kitchen table with a mug. She asked how my evening was, and I told her the train stopped, the lights went out, something hovered, and she did one of those looks people do when you've handed them a riddle you present as if it were small domestic news. She listened and didn't laugh or scoff. That held relief in it, an allowance that some things might make sense later or not. The next day, people at work talked around the incident in halves and bursts. Someone had uploaded a shaky clip to one of the local boards, and a dozen theories marched under it. Drones, military experiment, a leaking satellite in a low trajectory, mass hallucination. The official line from transit was signal fault, with a promise to investigate. I kept thinking about how the light had had no sound and how the radio control had been blank for a while and how that silence made my teeth feel funny when I remembered it. Months passed and the route returned to 1,000 uneventful commutes. The memory lives in the part of me that notices details, the way the conductor's hand shook, the hiss in the PA before it went dead, the sudden hush in the fields that cut the night into a different kind of space. Now and then, when the train runs through that stretch and the city lights fall away, I glance toward the old freight yards, like someone returning a book to the shelf and hoping to find an index. Mostly I find ordinary fog and signal lamps and the steady hum of electricity where it belongs. Sometimes, though, when the carriage goes quiet and I can't help it, I check my phone and make sure the display matches the world I can see, just to convince myself the map is still there. I woke to a sound like a refrigerator from a block away. It was that low, steady thing that sat under everything else. Not a bang, not a whistle, more an animal rumbling through the bones of the house. I thought at first it was the highway, some tanker idling out by the mill, but the highway is a mile off and never sounds like that. The clock read 2:12 a.m., and for a half second I considered going out in my slippers to see which neighbor had decided to run a generator. Then the windows trembled. My name's Evan Park. I run the hardware store on Main, Parks, which means I know half the town by the sound of their truck and what light bulb they prefer for porch lamps. I also sleep badly by habit, so I was already awake staring at the ceiling. I noticed the hum because the house shook the tiniest bit against the chest of my ribs. The light in the hallway flicked like a fish. I went to the kitchen and flipped the radio on for company. Static, then a station I didn't recognize sneaking through for a few seconds, then gone. The hum kept on, a steady freight train under the house. The cat, Buttons, walked across the counter and sat ears forward as if she could hear it better than I could. Outside, the town was thick with fog. October had decided to linger, and the damp made everything smell like wood smoke. The street lamp across the road hummed along with the sound. It was one of those nights when the world feels slotted into itself wrong, and little things complicate that. Porch lights blinking, a dog starting to whine on the next street, a car alarm in the distance that didn't finish its cycle. I poured coffee because I didn't trust my head alone. Half the people on our block know when I'm awake because I leave the shop light on and the front door ajar so the overnight mechanic Pete can grab keys if he needs. That morning I saw a silhouette move near his truck, so I slid on boots and a jacket and walked out. The hum was stronger the closer to the road I got. It vibrated the loose screw in the mailbox until you could hear a chitty noise if you leaned in. Pete was on his porch in his boxers and a knit cap, squinting up where the fog had a dull orange glow over it. "You hear that?" he asked, and that was the way most people asked about it for the next hour, as if asking the world something tentative. I told him yeah. He said his wife had called her sister in town, worried a transformer had blown. I said to check the breaker box, see if the whole block had stalled. He walked over to his garage and leaned into a panel like you do when you hope a problem is small and mechanical. The box showed nothing out of the ordinary. By 3, the whole town wasn't asleep. Folks stood by their porches, cups of coffee steaming, hair in towels or work shirts, and you could see the hum in the way they adjusted their stance. No one wanted to be the first to suggest anything strange, but the question hung, why were the windows shaking? Phones did what they always do when multiple people simultaneously poke at them, slow down. Messages from my sister in Boston took longer than they should to arrive. The emergency alert system on my phone beeped and then cleared with no text. The Main Street's neon clock over the bakery clicked in slow motion and read 3:07, then 3:06, then finally 3:07 again. Patterns, small disruptions, the sort of things you can explain because it's comforting to do so. Animals got peculiar. Mrs. Klein's cows across the river were at the fence milling more than eating. Their sides twitched with the vibration. A train that was due at 4 didn't blow its horn when it passed the marsh. It glided silent like it had been asked to be quiet. Buttons circled the chair 3 times and then hopped up into my lap like she'd decided that proximity was protection. News spread the way news does in a place this size over 3 porches and at the diner. I grabbed my keys and walked downtown because you have to see what the town is doing when your town goes slightly sideways. In front of the diner, Lauren had already set the folding chairs outside, and people clustered like islands. Mayor Hargrove stood near the old memorial fountain, face upward and hands in his pockets. Usually he's all that varnished smile and small talk. He looked tired and adult in a way I don't remember seeing him before. The humming had an order to it. It rose and fell like breath. When it rose, the windows would rattle in a thin metallic tremor. When it dipped, the tremor eased. The fountain's water shivered in its dish, but didn't spill. Nobody joked. We were too busy listening. "Is it the quarry?" someone called out. "They don't work the quarry at night." "Lightning," said another, though the sky held no thunder. Someone else said, "Maybe it's something under the town." as if a machine burrowed beneath us, a late-night project we weren't meant to know about. Each answer felt thin. At 3:36, the sheriff rolled up with his cruiser, lights muted. Because discretion is a kind of protocol in small towns. Deputy Lopez got out with a flashlight and joined the crowd. He radios the county, he said through his teeth, and called in a report. The tower in the next county sounded bored and then attentive. They told him to stay put and watch. People leaned into their jackets and watched the sky because that's what you do when the world sounds foreign. You look where it might be coming from. Little electrical hiccups continued. Street lamps blipped in a tidy sequence down Maple Alley, one after another, blinking out then on, like a slow Morse code none of us was fluent in. A digital billboard on the far side of town reversed its display for 30 seconds, flashing the letters backward like a mirror. The diner's coffee percolator started and stopped twice without anyone touching it. It was all the tiny things that make a night feel like a hand under your ribs. We called the power company. They said they had no anomalous loads on the grid. The phone company checked its lines and said their towers were green. The county said they had no aircraft on radar. Each time a report came back, nothing on the boards, the murky comfort slipped further away. You could see it in people's faces. They did that slow blinking you do when you're considering the idea that maybe your world is flexible. Then it stopped. Not faded. Stopped, like someone had unscrewed a lamp and the light simply wasn't there anymore. One breath after the hum cut, every window fell silent. The town's cats resumed a bored grooming. A couple of dogs that had been half whining fell suddenly quiet and sat down. My own heart was loud in my ears. Mayor Hargrove clapped his hands once, like he was trying to make the world return to normal. Nobody else clapped. For 1 second, the sky looked ordinary, a fog-bleached gray sliver above the roofs. And then, in an upward flash, something streaked. It wasn't a comet. It wasn't a plane. Imagine a line of white paper shoved up through the clouds with a force. The light moved up so fast it turned the fog into a silver sliver for a second, and then it was gone. Not a slow climb. Not a whistle. It shot like someone had pulled a string and flicked it. The sky where it had been seemed emptier when it left. The town made the sound it makes when it wants to sound nonchalant and fails. Low exclamations, little sharp breaths. Somebody's glasses fogged where they had been looking up. A kid in pajamas covered his mouth and laughed, because laughter is what you do with fear sometimes. The sheriff's radio squawked with a message from the county. The primary radar had recorded a fast vertical return, and then nothing. They were checking with the FAA. No aircraft were filed, no flares, no signs of anything conventional. We stood on the sidewalk for a long time after that. The fog thinly rolled and tried to act like nothing had happened. People went back inside in ones and twos, called relatives who lived out of state, or sat on their porches and smoked and kept watching. The diner turned into a confessional for a few hours. Folks slid into the booths and told one another what they'd each heard and how it felt. Mrs. Caldwell said her sewing machine had started while she slept and then stopped when the light went up. Pete said his old truck crankshaft vibrated like it wanted to leave the ground. I said nothing for a while and listened. I closed the shop at 8 that morning because business was thin and the local mood was thin, and closing felt sensible. The fog cleared as the sun climbed and the town returned to its ordinary geometry. Mail trucks, kids at the bus stop, a dog walker with a leash full of impatience. The newspaper ran a short piece with a photo of the streaked sky and a quote from the mayor calling for calm. A radio evangelist said something about signs. A science teacher from the high school made the rounds, giving interviews about atmospheric plasma and satellites. People waved away theories and kept their own private files of small things. The way a clock had read the wrong minute, the shiver in a cow's flank, a humming so exact you could set your fork to it. That afternoon, I found Buttons sunning on the stoop, and she let me pick her up without fuss. I locked the shop with the key I always use. For days afterwards, folks compared notes like you compare weather, what you had seen, what you had felt. We made jokes because it's easier than panic. We argued about whether to tell our children what happened or to let their days be ordinary. Some of us drove out to the highway and looked up at the patch of sky where the thing had gone. It was a blank patch of blue like the rest. Nobody stopped working. The mill ran, the school bus ran, my register balanced each night. Sometimes, when the town settles down and the sunset makes the sky a low bruise, I find myself stepping out of the shop and looking up, because habit is a kind of prayer. I listen for the low note. Usually it's gone. But some nights I think I hear a small, impossible undercurrent in the distance, like a threshold someone else has left ajar. The light that shot upward left the sky less certain than it used to be, and I carry that feeling home when I lock the back door. I woke up because the tent was bright. It wasn't bright in the way a flashlight is bright. It was a soft, uniform wash of pale green that filled the nylon like someone had slipped a sheet of light under the rainfly. I blinked and felt the light in the back of my eyelids. I sat up, heart figuring it was just dawn. But the phone on the ground read 2:07 a.m. in dull numbers that said the battery was low, and I'd left it on airplane mode. My name's Marcus. I work HVAC in Asheville most weeks, and I come up to Pisgah whenever a long string of late nights needs unwinding. I'd set camp on a spur off the Rough Ridge lot because it's quiet, the views are good, and the park police don't hassle you if you're tidy. I'd eaten a cold dinner, drunk a can of cheap beer I'd been saving for a while, and thought I'd sleep like someone who hadn't been awake for 30 hours. Instead, I'd woken to the tent like a lantern. Before I peeled back the flap, other small wrong things threaded through the night. The crickets had stopped. I could hear the stream half a mile below me, a familiar rush, but the nearer insects were entirely absent. At first, I thought it was the cold. Pisang evenings do that to noise. But my thermometer read 72, and no one else at the site said anything about the bugs dying. I remembered thinking it odd as I brushed my teeth. A half hour before the light, the campground's single security lamp had hiccuped twice. It did that old metal click then fade thing, as if someone had tapped the globe with a nail. I walked over and saw the lamp steady again, the bulb working, but one of the metal fasteners had been loosened like someone had picked at it and then set it back. I figured a raccoon, closed the flap, and told myself to stop pretending the forest was a curated stage set. There was also the sound that had woken me earlier that night, somewhere around 1:10, a thin metallic click like two coins struck together. It came from beyond Tent Row C, a steady single click at irregular intervals. Not a twig crack, not a bird. I zippered my headlamp and pointed it at the canvas of trees. All I saw were trunks, and the flashlight made those trunks look like somebody had painted them with a half-hearted brush. The click stopped when I trained the light on it. I waited, a stupid human thing, and the noise never returned. When I unzipped the inner mesh and peered out, the light haloed the porch of trees. The maples were black cutouts. The glow that had soaked my tent did not make a pool on the leaf litter. It sat low, like a fog that had remembered how to be light. I put my hand out of the mesh, and my fingers felt the night not warm, but dense, like the air had weight. For a second, I thought the neighbor's lantern had slipped over to my spot. There were two other tents, maybe 100 yards down the slope. A couple had returned from an evening hike, and their headlamp beam had swept close to my sight earlier. But when I stepped from the tent onto the grass, the light stayed put against the nylon. The other camps were dark silhouettes. No headlamps, no voices. I took my flashlight anyway. The beam cut the glow in the way a hand pushes through water. Where the light passed, the canvas looked normal, clothy, brown like a tent should. The green returned at the edge of the beam. I moved the headlamp in a slow circle, and the glow clung to the fabric the way condensation clings to glass. My jaw worked, trying to make the scene sensible. The headlamp's batteries were fresh, the beam was steady. The glow didn't flinch. There were practical things to check. Food bag zipped? Yes. Camp stove cold? Yes. GPS still sitting on the car dash? No. My GPS was in my pocket, which I'd find out 10 minutes later when I patted myself to check. The point is, I did the things you do to keep your brain from insisting the world is changing. I shouldered my rain jacket because the wood smoke felt heavier when you stood in it, and I walked toward the trail, that close enough to watch the trees, and close enough to the tent to be bailing out if something felt wrong. On the way out to the service road, I heard the owls stop. Real, living sound of two owls 3 ridges away went from hoot to silence, like someone had killed the batteries in the night. I stood for a moment, and then the owls started back up again. An odd pair of calls that didn't match the cadence from before. There was no movement out of the ordinary, but the hair at the back of my neck had gone prickly in that way that usually means you've walked into a place where the map of common sense doesn't quite reach. The source of the glow, when I rounded the front of the tent, looked like a pale coin pressed against the nylon from the outside. I could tell the shape, round, maybe the size of my palm, but no part of it showed a protrusion or a rim. It was as if someone had painted a shape with a light and hung it there with invisible pins. The smell of the air changed slightly. No ozone, no burnt metal, just a faint, clean smell that made me think of damp linen. I did the thing most people do when you want evidence and also feel ridiculous. I took a picture. The phone camera turned the scene into a washed rectangle where the glow registered as a lighter patch. I zoomed, snapped, took 3 frames. When I checked the shots later, they looked like a campfire's reflected light. On the phone, they were small and grainy and convinced no one of anything. I tapped the fabric with my palm. It made the thump you expect, felt like the right hardness. The glow did not flicker. It held. For a crazy second, the part I have to choke when I admit to it, I thought of slipping the tent door open fully and stepping out and following the light. That would have been a dumb decision. I stayed put, because the sensible parts of me render many more bad endings than the storybooks do. The glow retreated once, subtly, like someone took their hand away and then put it back. That little pullback made my throat close because it suggested the light could change on purpose. It didn't grow or shrink. It simply shifted closer to the guy rope on the west side and then settled again. When it moved, the canvas hummed in a tiny, high frequency that I could feel a little against my teeth. At one point, a man from the other campsite called out, "You okay over there?" His voice echoed wrong. No answer came from me that felt normal to speak. I called back, Yeah, just checking gear." And the man called back a quick, "All right." And the two of us went quiet in the way people do when the night gives them an invitation they don't want but feel obligated to accept. I did the only common sense, boring thing left. I packed. Not everything, just the essentials. I slid my sleeping bag, folded the pad, zipped them into the stuff sack. The glow never went out while I did this. It didn't flood the tent. Again, it was flat, not directional. So packing was done in 3 motions and with a lot of thinking about weather and sun. I stuffed my jacket, shoved the thermos in one pocket, and cinched the pack. My hands moved steady, which confused me. I'd expected to be shaky the whole time, but when you're trained to be practical, you find your muscles remember, despite your head. Before I shouldered the pack, I did one last thing. I unzipped the inner mesh and pulled back the flap slow, because if you do this like a thief, it distorts your senses less. The glow licked the edge like a fingertip. I stepped out into the night. The world emptied. Where I'd expected to find a machine, a person, a lantern, whatever explained the light, there was nothing but black. The maples swallowed the trail. My headlamp, which I kept off because the glow had the perversity of staying when it was not lit, showed only leaves like an oil painting when I swept the beam. No little coin of light at my boots, no soft lamp, no reflection from a camera. The glow was gone as if some tidy hand erased it. I stood on the damp leaf litter, listening to sounds that came back like they'd been on pause. The cicadas began late and clipped. Something barked 2 camps over. The stream's voice returned and had the same tempo as before. My phone stayed stubbornly at 2:12 a.m., even though the rest of the world had unpaused. I looked back at the tent and saw the faint dark rectangle where my headlamp had blind burned it. No green. No glow. After a minute of standing like a fool, I did something else sensible and mundane. I climbed back into the tent and lay down. I slept. I woke at 4:41 a.m. because the sky was the color of a bruise getting pale. I had a thought like a stone in my mouth. Did I dream the light? The cup of coffee in my pack told me I had not slept through the night entirely because the coffee was still hot around the edges. The other campers were packing up too. Talk low, gear clumsy. The man from the near tent passed me and said the strangest thing in a small voice. My compass went sideways last night. He didn't elaborate. I didn't ask. People will tell you what they want to tell you. I drove home the long way because that's what you do when a night hands you something without a corner to pin. The highway was 4 lanes of normal, of grocery trucks and taillights and radio DJs. I told myself the rest of the day like an inspector stamps a form. Tent collapsed dry, car windows up, no footprints around the site but mine. My phone had a dozen messages from coworkers asking what happened to me on a night I hadn't called in sick. I texted one line back, nothing. Strange night. Fine. At work the next week, I told the story in pieces. Coffee, then a late cigarette outside the boiler room, an offhand joke. Mostly people nodded and filled it in with their own small myths. An errant meteor, some new app that projects light for pretty pictures, the bar owner's friend who flies drones for fun. That's the way small towns take an odd event and return it to usefulness. They make it explainable. None of those answers fit the way the glow pressed against the tent and didn't ripple the leaves or the coin shape under the fabric like a secret someone had pressed there and then decided to hide. Maybe I could have stayed and watched until dawn and found the source. Maybe there was a rational explanation. Maybe the thing had been a man with a lamp, a prank, a trick of batteries and sleep-deprived neurons. None of those maybes helps the small, private place in me that remembers standing on black leaves with my breath visible for a moment and thinking the forest was holding its breath, too. I tell the story because it's what people do. It keeps the memory from feeling like possession. I packed the tent into the attic the next weekend, and I checked every seam like someone who had learned how to look for holes in the world. I camp now in places closer to the city where light is a constant and the night can't press quietly against the canvas. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I see that pale coin of light. It's not an image that screams for explanation. It's quieter than that. More like the memory of a sound that you can't hum back exactly. I keep the flashlight by the door of the house and the pack under the bed. If a thing like that finds me again, I'll probably do the same sensible things. Pack, zip, step out slow, and listen to whether the owls go on with their business or the owls go strangely silent. I woke up to the hum before anything else, like someone had put a low speaker under the whole house and turned it up just enough to notice. My eyes were still heavy. The clock on the nightstand said 2:03 a.m., blinking green in the dark. I lay there for a second, listening, thinking it was the refrigerator cycling or the HVAC kicking on. The sound wasn't sharp, more like a distant engine idling through a blanket. June, my tabby, already had one paw on my chest. She didn't usually do that unless there was thunder. When I shifted to push her off, she flattened herself down and stared at the bedroom door like she could see through walls. The hum changed pitch, almost like someone tightened a string. Then everything in the house came on. It wasn't a sneaky light here and there. It was all of it at once. Lamps downstairs flared, the oven's clock lit up in orange, the small kitchen radio that lives on the counter started up with a hiss and a snippet of static, the DVD player chimed, and the TV on the wall jumped to life with a blue screen. The garbage disposal clanked like it had gotten the power, but not the signal. The house filled with a million little mechanical noises stacked on top of each other, and for a wild second the sound felt like it had a direction, away from the window, like something had turned the whole place toward itself. I bolted upright so fast my head hit the headboard. June leapt off and zipped out the door. I slammed my feet into slippers and grabbed my robe, heart doing that stupid hammer rhythm. The hallway light was on. My watch read 2:04. My phone on the nightstand buzzed with 3 missed notifications, all from the same minute. I ran to the window that looks over the backyard. The yard was a dark square against the night. Above the maple tree, there was a light, a single white point, not a flashlight, not a porch light. It hovered maybe 20 feet above the branches and made the leaves below glow like green paper. It was the kind of brightness that didn't hurt to look at, but you knew would be wrong if it stayed. I don't know how long I stood there. I remember thinking, calmly and stupidly at first, that someone was testing a party light, that maybe a neighbor had one of those LED ball things and had thrown it over their fence. The neighborhood is full of techie people who buy weird stuff. The light shifted. It didn't move the way something pushed by wind does. It tilted sideways, a small, precise slide, and as it did, June's sawtooth tail hair stood straight up like she'd stuck a fork behind her ears. I saw a bead of reflected brightness on the neighbor's window, and then the light was gone. As quickly as it had all started, every appliance stopped. The TV blinked off. The oven clock froze at 2:04. Even the little kitchen radio went silent mid-hiss. The hum cut like someone had thrown a switch. The house was suddenly so quiet I could hear the furnace's faint afterbreath and the creak of the wooden stairs. I stood there with my hand on the glass, waiting for something to come back on to explain itself. For a moment I convinced myself it had been a power surge, the kind you get when a transformer trips or a limb hits a line. But the rest of the streetlights on our block didn't flicker. They glowed steady in the distance. The neighbor's security camera light blinked off and stayed off. The night resumed like nothing had happened, except for the fact the oven and the TV and everything else in my house had been on for an undetermined chunk of time, and I had no memory of it. I went downstairs anyway, barefoot on cold wood, and did the dumb domestic checks. Oven was empty. Stove knobs were in the off position. The microwave showed the same little clock face as the oven, 2:04, and was cool to the touch. The refrigerator was fine. No scorch marks, no damp spots. In the living room, the TV's remote had its little red LED blinking once, and then nothing. The DVD player had a disc still in the tray. When I pressed eject, it obeyed like normal. The house needed nothing. The house was normal. My pulse was not. June sat on the arm of the couch and licked her paw like nothing had happened. I kept waiting for her to bolt, but she stayed put and watched me the way cats watch small, incompetent predators. I called the municipal power line. I didn't want to call anyone and sound like a lunatic. The automated voice put me on hold. A woman finally answered and said there hadn't been a reported outage in my area, no surges, and nothing showing on their grid logs. She asked if any equipment inside the home had been damaged. I said no and didn't explain the hovering light. I told her the clocks had all restarted at the same minute, and she typed something and said they'd have a crew check the neighborhood cameras in the morning. Walking back through the kitchen, I noticed the little digital timer on the coffee maker had reset itself to 7, the default. My phone's lock screen said 2:09, 5 minutes after the little synchronized chaos. I thought maybe I had dozed off and the house had done its own electrical wake-up when I jerked. But everyone in the house, the cat at least, hadn't moved in whatever time had passed. Small things started to stack up the rest of the night. The window at the back of the house, the one that looks over the patio, had smudges on it where condensation had formed and then evaporated in a perfect ring, as if a sphere of warmth had hovered just outside and pulled moisture up and away. My backyard motion sensor was dead. Its little plastic eye sat blank like a watch without batteries. I walked the perimeter under the porch lights and found nothing unusual. No footprints in the grass, no soot on the decking, no singed leaves. Sleep kept slipping away from me. I sat on the couch with the blanket around my legs, telling myself all the reasonable things. Storms can cause brief surges. Older houses can be quirky. Cats are weird. But my hands wouldn't stop shaking. Around 4 a.m. I made coffee, watched the pot run, and tried to forget that I'd looked up and seen a light that didn't make sense. I tried to talk to my neighbor the next morning. Dave from across the street was outside washing his pickup. He squinted at my face and then at his own driveway like he was deciding whether he should go with me to make sure I was all right. I asked if he'd noticed anything last night. Lights, loud thumps, kids with drones. He shook his head. Nope. My security camera recorded some noise around midnight. Just a cat knocking a trash can. And then some light over by the Thompson place early this morning. But the footage cut out. He said it like a thing that was mildly inconvenient. Those cameras suck, he added, wiping his hands on a towel. His voice had the casual tone of someone who'd rather not have to reorganize his schedule around weirdness. Later, when I was at work in the hospital admitting desk, my colleague, Priya, laughed off my texting her about it. Maybe it's one of those new projectors folks buy for backyard parties, she said. I sent her the timestamps. Oven 2:04, microwave 204, TV 204, phone notifications 204. She stopped laughing. That's oddly synchronized, she admitted. Have you checked the county's emergency page? I tried to pull up the county site and the page lagged as if someone else had already pressed refresh 1,000 times. Nothing posted about strange lights or blackouts. The local police scanner had a couple of nuisance calls, dog complaints, a 2-car fender bender on Route 8, but nothing about lights or craft. The hospital's security camera feed that came through the registration area showed the parking lots as normal that night. I couldn't shake the small, stubborn thought that something in the sky had arranged its timing with the electronics in my house and then left the exact minute I looked up. That afternoon, I went out back with a notepad and wrote down everything I could think of. Clocks, what they'd been set to, which ones had reset, what had been on. I drew a little sketch of where the light had been over the maple tree. I measured the highest branch and figured it would have been maybe 18 feet up. Nothing I wrote explained why the radio had hissed in and then cut out, or why the entire kitchen's digital clocks resumed at the same second. People stopped by with their own small reports. The mail carrier said his vehicle's alternator had spiked early. He'd seen a flash across the road around 2 a.m. Mrs. Ehrlich from 2 houses down said all her porch lights flickered and then went off. But when she checked in the morning, they were on timers and worked fine. Someone at the hardware store told me they'd sold an unusual number of surge protectors the day before. No one had footage of the light itself. Those who had cameras found their files corrupted for a minute. A neighbor's dash cam showed a frame of pale glare over the street, and then nothing. Frame by frame, you'd swear it was just flare, like a car's headlight, until you scrubbed it and saw the sky was blackly empty where the glare had been. At night, the house seemed to keep one ear open. June slept in the same chair, but if I stood up, she tracked me like a guard. Occasionally a car passed, and the old familiar noise of tires over pavement felt like a healing thing. I lay awake, thinking about how ordinary the world looked in the morning, and how equivocally impossible the night had felt. The light had been there, and I'd seen it, and the clocks had all synchronized in a way that wasn't comfortable to explain. A week later, the city crews came by to check something in the street. One of the workers, Mark, who was younger than me and had a hopeful way about him, shrugged when I mentioned the time glitch. "We had a transformer go a couple blocks over last year," he said. "Sometimes the grid will hiccup with a storm or a truck or something, but if your clocks all reset the same second, I'd blame your router or a bad surge protector." He looked at my backyard like he expected a Ferris wheel to be parked there. I wanted to tell him about the ring on the back window, about the way the maple had looked under that light, about how June had gone still before it happened, but the words felt small when I pushed them out. Months passed and the night folded back into regular nights. The story made the rounds over coffee and at work, and then slowed down like nickels falling into a jar. I kept expecting it to make sense, someone to post footage that cleared everything up, a technician to point out a faulty circuit, or even a neighbor to sheepishly return a drone they shouldn't have flown at night. But the only consistent thing was how the memory lodged itself in the part of me that notices patterns. I could sketch the light's location from the porch, show you how the oven and the microwave and the TV all displayed the same minute, and I could point to the faint condensation ring on the back window that doesn't belong there. Everything else behaved like a world that hadn't just been interrupted. Sometimes, when the house is quiet and my phone is asleep on the charger, I stand at the window and just watch the maple. I don't expect to see anything. Usually it's just a tree against the night. Once in a while the thought will pop in, practical, small. Did a transformer hiccup exactly at 2:04 a.m.? Or did something parked above my yard make the house wake up and then vanish? I don't have an answer that fits all the little facts. So I put on the kettle, make another cup of coffee, and wait out the silence. The rest of the night usually holds steady until morning. It started with the dog. I was renting a small place outside of Springfield, Missouri that summer. My landlord, an older guy named Dennis, lived on the same property, but a few hundred yards down the gravel road. He had corn on one side and wheat on the other, and he let me keep my car in one of his sheds. We'd sit on his porch sometimes, drink a beer, and talk about the weather. He had this mutt named Briscoe, a black and tan dog with a deep bark that carried across the fields. Friendly during the day, always wagging his tail, but he took his guarding seriously. One night in July, I was up late with the windows open. It was hot, sticky, no breeze, one of those nights where even the cicadas sounded tired. Around midnight, Briscoe started barking. Not just a couple barks. Full-on, non-stop barking, the kind where a dog doesn't pause to catch its breath. At first, I figured it was coyotes. They're common out there, and Briscoe hated them, but usually he'd bark a few times and then quiet down. This was different. He kept it up for hours. I finally gave up on sleep and walked out to my porch around 2 in the morning. From there, I could see Dennis's yard light in the distance. Briscoe was right at the edge of the wheat field, planted that year in this big, flat section behind the house. He wasn't pacing or moving around, just standing in one spot, barking straight into the crop. His whole body was rigid, like every muscle was locked. I yelled for him a couple times, but he didn't even glance my way. Just kept barking, throat raw, like something had him dead set. It went on until close to dawn. Around 5, the barking finally stopped. I assumed Briscoe had worn himself out, or Dennis had pulled him inside. I went back to bed for a couple hours. When I got up and headed over to return a ladder I'd borrowed, Dennis was already out in the field. Briscoe was lying near him, panting hard, tongue out, looking exhausted. I asked Dennis what the dog had been going crazy about all night. He just pointed deeper into the wheat. That's when I saw it. A circle, clean as if it had been drawn with a giant stencil. The stalks were pressed flat, all in the same direction, not broken but bent. It hadn't been there the day before. I knew because I'd driven past on the gravel road that afternoon and the wheat had been smooth and unbroken all the way across. The circle was exactly where Briscoe had been barking. Same line of sight. Dennis wasn't the type to get worked up. He kept shaking his head, muttering about damn kids with boards and ropes. But even as he said it, I could see he didn't believe it. There hadn't been any tire tracks, no footprints, nothing disturbed except the wheat inside the circle. We walked into it together. The air felt heavier, like stepping into a sauna, even though the sun wasn't fully up yet. It wasn't hot outside, but standing in that formation, sweat started to bead on my forehead almost immediately. Briscoe followed us to the edge but wouldn't go in. He paced back and forth, whining low, completely different from the fierce barking he'd done the night before. When I crouched to look at the stalks, I realized they weren't snapped. Each one was bent just above the ground at almost a perfect right angle, like someone had softened them and folded them down. Dennis pulled a compass out of his truck a little later, an old silver one he'd kept from his army days. He held it over the center of the circle, and the needle swung like crazy. It wouldn't lock onto north. He frowned and stepped back a few feet. Outside the circle, it settled immediately. He didn't say anything, just closed it up and slipped it back in his pocket. By afternoon, word had gotten out. A couple of neighbors stopped by, then some kids from town. Everyone wanted to walk into the circle, take pictures. Briscoe stayed under the porch, head down, watching them. Every time someone crossed the edge into that circle, his ears went back and he gave this low growl. That night, I was sitting on my porch again. It was a little cooler, the crickets loud, and I was half expecting Briscoe to start up again. Sure enough, around midnight, he went back to the same spot, not barking this time, just standing there, stiff as a post, staring at the wheat. The thing was, there was no new circle that night. Nothing appeared. He just stared, silent, for nearly an hour. Eventually, Dennis came out and called him in, and that was that. I moved away a couple months later when my job transferred me, but I never stopped thinking about that first morning, how the dog seemed to know exactly where that circle would show up, barking at nothing all night long until it was just there. It was close to midnight when I left my friend Kevin's place. He lives out in the country, about 40 minutes from where I rent a place in town. It had rained earlier that day, and by the time I was heading home, a thick fog had rolled in over the hills. I took the back road instead of the highway. It's shorter, but there are no streetlights and barely any shoulder. I've driven it 100 times, but that night, it felt different. The fog was dense enough that my high beams just made it worse, so I kept them low and drove maybe 30 miles an hour. The only sound in the car was the hum of the tires and the faint rattle from my dashboard when I hit rough patches. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of the moon through gaps in the fog, this pale, hazy disk that didn't give off much light. I'd just come down a long, sloping stretch with trees on both sides when it happened. 1 second, I could see the glow of the moon through the fog, and the next, it was gone, completely blocked out like someone had thrown a tarp over the sky. The darkness inside the car deepened instantly, and I knew it wasn't just a cloud because the fog itself didn't thicken. Something was between me and the moon. The shape, if you could call it that, was massive. I couldn't see any edges, no outline, just an absence of light overhead. It stretched far past the road in both directions. It stayed above me for several seconds, maybe 5 or 6, and then moved on, slowly. No wind, no sound, nothing. I didn't even realize I'd slowed to almost a stop until I glanced at the speedometer. My hands were locked on the wheel. The moonlight came back as suddenly as it had gone, dim and milky through the fog, and I just kept driving like nothing happened. A mile or so later, I pulled off onto a gravel turnout that overlooks a little valley. I think I just needed to catch my breath. I rolled down the window, half expecting to hear, I don't know, maybe distant engines or a low hum, but it was dead silent. Even the frogs and crickets I usually hear out there were gone. When I stepped out of the car, the first thing I noticed was the fog. It wasn't cool anymore. It was warm. Not hot, but like stepping into a heated bathroom after a shower. My jacket felt damp instantly, and the air clung to my skin in a way that didn't feel natural. The gravel under my boots was slightly wet, but the warmth didn't seem to be coming from the ground. It was just everywhere around me. I stood there for a minute, scanning the sky. The fog made it impossible to see more than a few yards up, but I kept expecting to catch some kind of movement above. I didn't. Then I heard a sound behind me, off in the trees. Not an animal, at least, not any animal I recognized. It was faint, like a rustle mixed with a low, irregular clicking. It would stop for a few seconds, then start again, a little closer each time. I shined my phone's flashlight toward the tree line, but the beam just bounced off the fog, lighting up a wall of gray. I told myself it was just branches shifting in the breeze, but the air was still. No wind at all. I got back in the car and shut the door, locking it without even thinking about it. I sat there for a while with the engine idling, watching my own breath in the cabin. The temperature inside should have felt warm with the heater on, but it didn't. It felt like the dampness from outside had followed me in. My windshield started to fog up from the inside, even though the defroster was running. After maybe 10 minutes, I decided to just get home. I pulled back onto the road and took it slow, scanning both the sky and the edges of the forest. The moon stayed visible through the fog the whole way, but every time I went under a thicker patch of trees, I felt that same heaviness in the air. About 10 minutes from town, the fog thinned, and the temperature in the car seemed to go back to normal. I could hear insects again, a few frogs, even a dog barking somewhere in the distance. It felt like whatever that was hadn't followed me past the hills. When I got home, I went straight inside without unloading anything from the car. My clothes still felt damp, and the smell of the fog, this earthy, metallic scent, lingered in the fabric until I washed them the next day. I've driven that same road at night a few times since, in all kinds of weather. Nothing like that's happened again. But I still catch myself glancing up at the sky when I pass that turnout, just in case. I was coming down off the ridge when the cornfield stopped being a cornfield. It was late July, the kind of dry, heat-soaked dusk where the air trembled above the highway. I'd been on my wheels since before dawn, load of feed out of Indiana, headed west, and I'd been watching fields for hours just to keep my eyes from glazing over. I remember thinking how ordinary everything looked. Rows and rows, tractors in the distance, the smell of dust when a car passed. Then, maybe a half mile off the shoulder, something was hovering right over the stalks as if it had decided to park there. It was triangle-shaped, flat on the bottom like an upturned wedge, the points notched with small dim lights. It hung maybe 40, 50 feet up, low enough that the corn tops bowed a little where whatever it was cast a shadow. There was no sound, not a hum, not the whining of props, just the same insects and road noise I'd been hearing for miles. It didn't move like anything mechanical I knew. It rolled slow, like it was reading the field with some kind of even motion, then tilted and drifted a few yards and stopped. I pulled off into an old farm turnout and killed the engine because I didn't trust the bass in the cab would keep me from hearing something. The truck sat and settled. The radio died down. The air felt thick and close, like the world had been squeezed and the center pressed flat. A flock of starlings had been peppering the field a minute before, then they were gone. I scanned the tree line and the sky, expecting a crop duster or a banner or something sensible. Nothing. Just that triangular silhouette against a strip of bruised clouds. I grabbed my phone and hit record because it felt like the right thing to do, the only thing. The battery icon was solid. The camera showed the shape in the distance like it was in every other video I'd taken. Then the screen fuzzed. Not pixelation like a bad cell tower, more like the image and the real thing stopped lining up. I could see it with my eyes as clear as my windshield, but the phone's live view behaved like someone had put a hand in front of the lens for a second. One heartbeat of black, and when it came back, the triangle was a shade to the left. The phone logged the video and the file acted fine, but the second where the object jerked didn't look like any glitch I knew. I stood there until the light faded and it eased up and away into the low clouds, a small dark shape swallowed by gray. I felt stupid calling dispatch over it, but I radioed my dispatcher anyway. Something odd at mile marker 52 over the Briggs farm. And the reply was the kind of clipped, neutral thing meant to make a man stop talking. Copy. Keep rolling. You don't get a lot of time to make decisions. I sat in the cab until the stars blurred. I wanted to do two things. Drive on until I was out of whatever that was, and call someone who'd give me an answer, or get down in the field and poke through the corn to find out if anything was missing. The first is the habit of a man whose paycheck comes from staying moving. The second was a kind of foolishness I kept myself from indulging. I made myself drive. The highway was empty and the cab was cool. The lane lights rattled past. I kept checking the side mirror though, thinking I'd see the thing again, and sometimes I thought I could. Some crooked, hard-to-place outline on the horizon, but it could just have been memory playing tricks. My next planned stop was at a small interstate truck plaza, a blue-roofed place with a diner that did good pie. I figured I'd get coffee, stretch, and that would be it. Maybe my stomach or the pie or the sleeping shift would quiet whatever attention the sky had put on me. I pulled into the lot and parked in my usual row. That's when I saw them. Two men in black, standing together near the end of the convenience store where the propane tanks sit. They were spaced a little too perfectly, like bookends. Both had on dark suits, narrow ties, shiny shoes, the kind of unruffled getup you see in movies when someone mysterious steps out of a cab. They were watching the lot, watching the traffic, and watching me. I got out of the truck slow and went to the restroom like it was the most ordinary thing I could do. When I came back, the men were still there. A woman in a reflective vest filled her water jug at the pump, and they didn't turn their heads. The cashier at the window kept glancing at the door, then back to the register. I could feel the way the men looked at me without moving their heads. Just eyes like two lenses fixed on a point. They didn't enter the store, they didn't stand in line, they didn't buy coffee or a pack of smokes. They just stayed at that end of the lot and watched the lot, watching people, watching me. It made me want to leave my coffee and donuts and get back behind the wheel and roll off the lot. I had this ridiculous urge to back up and pull out because staying would give them a chance to do something. It sounded ridiculous even in my head, like one of those thoughts you get when sleep is catching up, but I felt it all the same. I walked over to the air and stretched, fingers under my shirt, trying to keep it casual. One of them shifted his weight for the first time since I'd seen them, not toward me in a way that suggested movement, Just the smallest reach, the slightest turn so that his shoulder lined up with mine. Identical faces, I realized then. Same jawline, same eyes, same expressionless mouth. And they were both focused like the lot was a stage. No cashier came outside. No security walked up. A handful of drivers went about their business, oblivious. I tried the polite smile, the small signal human gesture drivers use to diffuse things. Nothing. They didn't smile back. They didn't blink much, if you noticed. Men in black at a rest stop. There's a kind of joke cab chatter about that, about conspiracy hours and encounters, and usually it's laughed at over coffee. I thought of the dispatcher's voice saying, "Keep rolling," and realized again I had no goddamn sense of where to put this. My friend Luis calls me brave for showing him the video on my phone later that night. I couldn't have shown it if I'd scanned the footage first, because the clip had an odd jump exactly where the object crossed the frame, like someone had spliced a different bit of cloud in. The audio track had a second of high, thin static that looked like a recorded squeal on the wave, then nothing. Luis leaned back and blew out a breath and said, "Keep your ears open." He meant, of course, the sensible thing. Keep your eyes and ears open while you drive and don't do anything stupid. At some point during those coffee and pie minutes, I went and bought the pie. I set it on the passenger seat because habit says a man shouldn't get on the road hungry. When I came back out, the two men were still standing there. The sun had dipped a little more. They were unmoving in that way that made them look like part of the furniture. I got in the truck, started the engine, and pulled out. They watched me leave. No hand waves, no approach, just the watching. I told myself it was coincidence. Men in suits parked because they liked the spot or were working on something official. But when I passed a second rest area an hour down the road just to stretch again, I saw a sedan parked under the far light. No one near it. The driver's door was closed. The license plate was clean. From the angle I got as I rolled by, I could have sworn I saw someone in a dark suit sitting perfectly still on the passenger side, staring forward. I haven't said anything to my company about the craft or the men. I filed a short note in my log. Saw unknown object over Briggs Farm. Photo saved. That's where it sits. It reads small, like a man who is trying to make a brush mark in a ledger and not a confession on a blog. At home that night, my daughter asked why I smelled like diesel and pie. She wanted to know about the sky looking orange on the way in. I said the usual, the highway, heat, a long day. We ate and watched cartoons, and I put the phone away. I don't know who the men were or why they didn't buy anything or why one of them had a tie that didn't move in the breeze. I don't know whether whatever was over the Briggs farm was watching something or looking for something, or whether I'd been the only human who happened to notice. All I know is that when the lot was full of drivers, coffee to go, diesel fumes, the little clutter and noise of people running short errands, two men in black stood at the edge and did nothing but watch. I kept rolling. The pay is good for the miles, and the miles are my business. If it is anything else, it hasn't told me yet. I was driving back from visiting my cousin in Eastern Oregon, taking one of those long two-lane highways that feel like they cut through the middle of nowhere. It was late afternoon, the kind of overcast sky that flattens the light so you can't tell if it's getting close to evening or not. I'd been watching my gas gauge dip for the last 20 miles, so when I spotted a faded sign for a station up ahead, I figured I'd stop. The place looked old, but not abandoned. One pump island, a little shop with a single front window, and a tall sign with half the letters missing. The gravel crunched under my tires when I pulled in. I'd barely shifted into park when a man stepped out from around the side of the building. He was wearing a blue work shirt with Martin stitched on a patch over the pocket and a tan cap pulled low. He smiled as he walked up, one hand already on the pump handle. "Evening," he said, cheerful. "Fill it up?" I nodded, rolled my window down halfway, and handed him my card. He swiped it on a little handheld reader hanging from his belt, then started pumping gas. "Bit of a cold snap coming in tonight," he said, glancing at the clouds. "Gonna be down to the high 20s after sunset." I remember blinking at that because I'd been driving all day in short sleeves with the windows cracked. My car thermometer had read 74 when I pulled in. Really? I said. Feels pretty warm right now. Martin chuckled, like I'd made a joke. Not for long. Last night it was barely over 30 by the time the moon was up. Something about the way he said it made me check my own watch, even though that didn't have anything to do with temperature. It was 4:42 p.m. He kept chatting, asked where I was headed, if I'd passed the road construction near Ochoco. His voice was easy, calm, like we were old neighbors catching up. I found myself answering without thinking much about it, but I kept glancing at my dashboard thermometer, which still said 74. When the pump clicked off, he handed me my card back and thanked me like I'd done him a favor by stopping in. I got out to stretch my legs, and he stepped away from the pump island, walking toward the far side of the building like he was going to check something. I figured I'd go in and grab a drink before heading out. The shop door had a little bell that rang when I opened it, and the inside smelled faintly of motor oil and old candy. A woman in her late 50s stood behind the counter, flipping through a magazine. "Hey there," I said, setting a bottle of water on the counter. "You got a good guy working the pumps out there." She looked up, puzzled. "Working the pumps?" I smiled, thinking she was joking. "Yeah, Martin. Blue shirt, cap. He filled me up." Her brow furrowed. "Honey, we haven't had a pump attendant in, must be 6, 7 years now. It's self-serve." I just stared at her for a second. "No, I mean, he was just out there. He took my card and everything." She shook her head slowly, like she wasn't sure if I was messing with her. "I'm the only one here. Has been all day." I didn't know what to say to that. I pulled out my wallet, slid a 20 across for the water, and stepped back outside without pushing it. The pump island was empty. No sign of Martin. The gravel lot stretched out on all sides, flat and open, no cars but mine. I glanced toward the side of the building where he'd walked earlier. Nothing. I climbed back into my car, shut the door, and sat there with the engine off for a minute. The temperature reading on my dash still said 74. The air coming in through the cracked window was mild, the kind of early fall warmth that sinks slow. When I backed out, I drove past the far side of the building. I didn't step just to see. There was only a stack of old tires, a rusty dumpster, and weeds pushing through the gravel. No footprints, no sign anyone had been there at all. I got back on the highway. About 10 minutes later, I realized I was gripping the steering wheel too tight. My mind kept replaying his voice, the way he'd smiled like we were sharing some casual, harmless talk. The weather he'd described didn't match reality, but it also hadn't sounded like a guess. He'd said it like it was a certainty, like it was already happening. And the weirdest part was my card. I checked my banking app at the next rest stop. There was no charge from the station, nothing from anywhere in that town. It was only later, maybe 30 miles down the road, that I noticed something else. My car thermometer had dropped to 52, and I hadn't crossed into any higher elevation. The sun was still an hour from setting. I was on the switchbacks below Guadalupe Peak before the sun even hit the saddle, boots squelching on packed limestone, when my watch blinked over and over and then went dark. That was the first small odd thing. No storm, no drop signal on the Ranger map, just the cheap Garmin I carried for route logging, deciding it didn't want to play anymore. I shoved it back into my pack and kept going. Name's Marta Reyes. I hike these parts every few months to keep my head straight from the clinic in Van Horn. I knew the trail, and I knew the way the piñon and juniper smelled in morning cold. I knew where the cairns sat, like punctuation marks. The second odd thing was birds. 1 minute the scrub was a chorus, chipping, scolding, the scratch of sparrows. I whistled out a note, and the sound stopped as if someone cut a switch. It wasn't the coyotes. They don't sing then. The silence felt like falling through cotton. I stopped and scanned the draw below me and the slope above, and nothing moved but the ragged grass. For a while I thought maybe I just walked into a pocket of quiet. I waited. A lizard blinked on a rock and a scrub jay complained from a tree far off, but the immediate world stayed hushed in a way that pressed on my ears. I took out my phone to mark the waypoint, and it read, "No signal." Even though I'd been able to ping a ranger an hour before, my GPS handheld The old backup I never trusted unless I had to showed the trail in bright blue. I watched my little icon crawl along the path and felt a soft ease, the way you do when you see the map match what your feet tell you. Then the map jumped. It didn't glitch in that wobbling way electronics do. 1 second I was on the switchback near the creosote, and the next the pin on the screen was over Devil's Chalk, almost a mile and a half distant, across a bowl I'd take half an hour to reach at a good pace. I stood there, and my stomach did a little lurch like when a car in front of you brakes hard. Maybe the receiver had it wrong. Maybe there was a reflected signal. I laughed out loud, a short bark that sounded too loud in the quiet. I tapped the screen, and the blue dot shivered, and then smiled back into the correct place. I told myself it was nothing but a battery hiccup. I kept going. The day warmed fast, and I shed a layer. The sun stole up and dressed the limestone in white. I passed the old miner's cairn and crossed the loose scree where I always watch my step. Then, because I've got a habit of checking both the trail and my devices, I pulled the handheld out again to log the view from the bench where the chisos looked like distant bruises. The device read I'd moved again. Only this time it read that the trip meter had ticked 3 miles I hadn't walked. The time showed 20 minutes later than my watch said. My pulse kicked. I checked the sun's angle, counted the cairns backward, said the names of 2 dead friends under my breath like a talisman. I could see the crest of the ridge I'd meant to be on, but the numbers didn't line up with what the ground said. I told myself the obvious things. Electronics lie, radio signals bounce, batteries blip. I knew how to triangulate with the sun if need be. I used my thumb to shelter the handheld and checked my surroundings. A scatter of barrel cactus, a weathered pinon whose trunk spiraled like a knotted rope, the bone-white rock with a face I always note because it looks like a sleeping dog. It was all there. It was real. So was the wobble on the GPS. It was the third small thing that pushed me from irritation into something that tasted like unease. I passed a spot where a shepherd had left a coil of orange flagging to mark a water catchment years ago. The flagging was pulled tight and arranged in a little spiral atop a rock, as if someone had uncoiled it and rewound it neat and true. There were no other footprints around, only the usual animal scuffs. The spiral looked deliberate. For a second, I wondered whether some kids had been up and about before sunrise. Then I remembered the silence and the 2 sudden jumps of my waypoint, and I gathered my pack straps like a person steadying a ladder. I hiked on, keeping my route. The trail dips and climbs thin and stubborn through that quarter mile to the saddle. You can see forever if you stand still long enough. About 15 minutes from the bench, my head started to ache in that pressure behind the eyes way I get if I forget to eat. I dug a granola bar out and sat on a slab, slouching with my back to a windbreak and looking at the valley like an old map. I watched a cloud fold itself over the far ridge and then noticed 3 things at once. A smell. Electric, sharp like the metal tang after a lightning strike, though there had been none. A faint ringing in my ears at a pitch that sat under the heartbeat, and a blank on the trail where I'd expect footprints. The last set I'd left behind was the print of my left boot. Ahead of me, the dust showed nothing, as if the trail had been swept. I stood up and checked my watch. It was 20 minutes after the time I'd noted when I sat. That was possible in the math of the trail. You stop, you snack, you photograph. But my handheld had logged me as moving during a stretch I remembered sitting, logged me as passing a feature I hadn't passed. The map on the handheld showed a smooth line that cut across contour in a way you'd only manage with a rope and a rope team. There were no scratch marks on rocks, no gear. I felt a hot, idiotic laugh crawl up my throat that I swallowed down. The air still had that copper bite to it. I pinched the bridge of my nose and tried to breathe normally. I hiked the last push to the saddle, alert like a rabbit. My boots felt heavy, like I was walking through a shallow pan of syrup. When I crested the rise, the view was the one that always steadied me, the Texas plain like a spread of paper, the horizon a fine pencil line. I sat on the same bench where I'd meant to log the photo, and the handheld chirped like an apology, or maybe like a reprimand. It showed the waypoint where I had been 20 minutes earlier. It showed 2 miles logged in a time it shouldn't have taken. I stared at it until the numbers made me dizzy, and then I put the handheld away. Ranger Station was a small logbook and a box of trail maps. When I stopped by later to ask about signal repeaters or anything odd, no one had anything to say beyond the usual: animals, weather, lost hikers. I told the woman at the desk I thought my handheld had been lying. She smiled and said gadgets do that sometimes, especially up there where the canyon walls like to throw signals back like mirrors. Her hands were steady and warm. She didn't press any questions. On the drive back to Van Horn that evening, I tried to frame the day into something tidy. Maybe I'd nodded off for a minute and walked with muscle memory across a spur and not remembered it. People do that in towns. Maybe there was some odd reflection from a repeater on a radio tower. The explanation sat close enough to the truth to be comfortable, and I wanted the comfort. But the spiral of flagging didn't fit a sleepy walk. The hush on the trail didn't fit neatly with a signal bounce. More than once that day, I felt like I was following a path someone else had smoothed out for me and then erased. I slept at home with the window cracked and the scent of juniper waved into the house. I put the handheld on the counter with its battery bars full and watched it cycle through map screens like an eye. There's no neat end to the day. The trail was the trail. I drove the ridge again a week later with a friend, and we walked every foot of the stretch where my device had said I'd cut across, and there was no place a person could have gotten across without leaving a trace. We took bearings by sun and stone, and the lines came out honest. The handheld still shows a line like a seam where I apparently slipped through ground I did not cross. I came away with bruises from the memory, a thin, persistent knot of things that don't quite line up when you lay them side by side. A watch that blinked out, a quiet like cotton, a map that says I walked where I did not, a spiral of orange flagging wound meat on a rock. I don't have any bright claim because there wasn't one, not in any language I trust. I just had a morning in the mountains that rearranged the small certainties I use to measure myself. Some nights I replay the trail in my head like a map and try to find the seam. I was driving home late one Saturday night on State Highway 71 out near Lano. It's a stretch I know well, mostly empty road, rolling hills on either side, a few ranches spaced out enough that you don't see a soul for miles. I'd been out visiting my cousin in town and was looking forward to getting back to my place before too late. The sky was clear, stars bright, and the kind of quiet you only get out in the hill country. I was doing about 65, headlights cutting through the dark when, just up ahead, I noticed a pale light hovering low, right over the road. It wasn't like a car or a truck. The shape didn't have edges or a body I could make out. Just this soft, pale glow, like the color of those old mercury vapor street lamps, but floating maybe 4 feet above the asphalt. It flickered a bit, like it was struggling to hold steady but didn't move. At first, I figured maybe it was some road flare or a piece of trash caught on a sign or something, but there weren't any signs there, just open road and a small rise to the left where the land crests before dropping down toward the creek. No buildings, no lights from anywhere. I slowed down, kept my eyes on it, and the light stayed. It wasn't warm or harsh, more like a dim bulb someone left on by accident. Then, right as my headlights were about to reach it, the light just vanished. Like someone turned it off. The air where it had been was just black. The moment my beams hit that spot, I saw nothing there. No flicker, no glow, no reflection. Just the regular flat black of asphalt and the faint outline of the brush along the shoulder. I blinked a few times and slowed down some more, looking for anything that could explain it, but there was nothing. I kept driving, my pulse picking up a little. That stretch of 71's pretty straight and open, and I'd been watching the light for a good 30 seconds before it blinked out, so I wasn't imagining it. A mile or so down the road, I caught a glimpse of some small movement off to the right, where the mesquite trees lined the hill. It wasn't a deer or a coyote, not the way it moved. It was quick, deliberate, and it vanished before I could get a proper look. I shook my head and told myself it was just the night messing with me. The shadows in the brush, maybe a bobcat or something. The night can play tricks if you're alone long enough. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling something was watching. My skin prickled like when a storm's rolling in, but the sky's clear. About halfway home, the radio suddenly dropped into static. I was tuned to a local station playing some old country songs, but the music cut out completely. For a minute, all I had was this low static buzz. I fiddled with the dial, but none of the stations would come in clearly. The static wasn't like interference from hills or storms. It was steady, like a wall of white noise pressed against the car. I pulled over at a turnout to check my phone, but of course no service out there. Typical. When I looked back up, the road was empty. No lights behind me, no other cars anywhere. Then, from the edge of the trees on the left, I caught the faintest flash of something. Just a glimmer, like a reflection, or maybe a pair of eyes. I stared, waiting for it to move again. It didn't. When I turned my head to get a better angle, the flash was gone. I didn't want to sit there longer, so I got back in the truck and kept going. When I passed the spot where that light had hovered, I slowed even more and scanned the ditch and the trees again. There was nothing. No footprints, no tire tracks, no signs anyone had been there. Just that empty stretch of road. But the weirdest part was the silence. Not the usual country silence. No crickets, no frogs, no night birds. It was like the whole area had been wrapped in cotton. Even the hum from the engine sounded muffled. I put the truck in drive and started moving again, trying to shake the weird feeling in my gut. The radio came back on about 5 minutes later like nothing had happened. The DJ was talking about the weather like a normal Saturday night. Still, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, feeling like I might see something, but all I saw was black road and the occasional flicker of headlights from the distant highway junction near town. By the time I got home, I was more tired than I'd thought, but I couldn't settle in. Every time I looked out the window, I thought about that light, how it just vanished right before my eyes, and how everything felt like it was holding its breath on that stretch of road. I checked the truck the next morning, thinking maybe some light from a stray reflector had caught my eye or a road crew had been out there. Nothing. The windshield was clean. No dirt or dust that would have made a reflection. The tires had no unusual wear and the truck ran smooth as always. I asked around the next day, mentioning the light to a couple of local guys who knew the area. One told me about a similar thing he'd seen a few years back. Something hovering low, flickering, disappearing. Said he didn't know what it was either, but he wasn't about to hang around and find out. Another guy just laughed and said maybe I'd been looking at a will-o'-the-wisp or some road ghost, but he said it in that half-joking way that's really just saying, I don't have a clue. I've been back on 71 plenty since then, and nothing like that light's ever come back. But sometimes when the night's just right, clear, quiet, and with that wide open sky, you can still feel it there, just past the curve where the trees lean in close to the road. I don't know what it was. Could have been a trick of the eyes, some weird electrical thing, or maybe just my mind playing with shadows and light. Whatever it was, it felt deliberate, like something watching, waiting. I guess out here, that's just part of the night. You learn to keep your eyes open, but not so open, you lose your mind. You don't expect much to happen on a Thursday night at the Springfield Community Baseball Field. It's not a big stadium or anything, just the usual setup with 4 poles holding the floodlights, a worn-out chain-link fence, and a cracked asphalt parking lot that smells like old popcorn and fresh-cut grass. I've been coming here since I was a kid, and honestly, most nights it's just crickets, the occasional late jogger, or some group of teenagers messing around. That night, though, everything felt off right from the start. I'm Mark Dutton, by the way, and I live just a few blocks from the field, so I usually come here to clear my head after work. It's quiet, and there's not much to worry about. I got there around 10:15 p.m. It was chilly for late July. Ohio summers get humid, but that night the air was strangely still, like someone hit pause on everything. There were a handful of teens sitting on the bleachers. They were tossing a baseball back and forth, laughing, but it wasn't the usual loud, easygoing noise you hear. They were quieter, watching the sky more than the game. I figured maybe someone spotted a satellite or something, so I looked up too. That's when I saw it. Hovering right above the tallest floodlight pole was this weird shape. I don't even know how to describe it right. It wasn't like any airplane or drone I'd ever seen. It was a dark shape, almost a silhouette, but it didn't have clear edges. More like a shadow hanging in the air with this faint, almost oily shimmer around it, like heat haze, but colder, if that makes any sense. No blinking lights, no sound, nothing that should be there at all. The teens noticed it too. One of them, a kid named Joey, I think, pointed at it, eyes wide. "Hey, what the hell is that?" We all stayed quiet, just watching. The ball got dropped, and no one said a word. Then, after a minute or so, one of the kids, a girl named Casey, picked up a rock from the dirt near the fence and threw it straight at the thing. Like, it was almost a reflex, but braver, or maybe just dumb. The rock didn't hit anything, it just kind of disappeared as it flew through the shape. And then, the whole thing vanished. Just like that. No sound, no flash, no trick of the light. 1 second it was there, the next it was gone. But that's not the worst part. Right after it disappeared, every single floodlight on the field exploded at once. Not just flickering or going out, full-on explosions. The lights blew out with this loud pop and sparks flying everywhere. The glass shattered and fell like rain, and the whole field went pitch dark. I swear, the way that happened was like someone pulled the plug on reality for a moment. Everyone froze. The teens started yelling and scrambling for their cars. I could hear a few people cursing about the lights, the noise, all that. I was standing there, heart pounding, thinking, what the hell did I just see? It got quiet again, except for the broken glass tinkling on the ground. I walked over to the fence, looking up at the empty sky where the thing had been hovering. The stars looked normal, but I felt like something was missing. Like the night had a gap, a blank spot in the usual hum of sounds and smells. A couple of the teens hung back, eyes glued to the dark tree line beyond the parking lot. Joey kept saying, "Did you see that? That thing was real. It just vanished." I nodded, but didn't say anything. I wasn't sure if I wanted to admit I was freaked out or not. We stood there for a few minutes, the only light coming from the street lamps down the road. Then out of nowhere, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, but it wasn't my usual notifications. The screen was weird, all staticky, like it was having trouble pulling a signal. The time jumped back and forth, flickering between 10:18 and 9:42 for a good 20 seconds before settling at 10:19. I showed the others. They all looked confused. Casey said her phone had been acting weird too, like it lost service for a bit and then popped back on. I'm not sure how long we stood there after that, but the feeling of being watched started to creep up on me. Like someone, or something, was standing just beyond the trees, staring. I glanced over my shoulder a few times, but never saw a thing. The weird thing about that place is how open it is. There's nowhere to hide behind the field except the woods on the edges. You can see the road and some houses a ways off. But that night, the woods felt like a wall of silence. No rustling leaves, no animals, just stillness. After a while, I told the kids to get going before someone called the cops about the lights or something. We said our goodbyes, but none of us looked away from the dark tree line. When I got home, I tried calling my wife, but the call wouldn't connect. The phone showed no service, which was odd since I usually get a full bar right there. I checked all the windows and doors, made sure the house was locked, but the unease stuck around. I couldn't sleep that night. Every creak in the house, every flicker of streetlights outside, felt like a sign something was watching. The next morning, the field was a mess. The exploded lights had left scorch marks on the poles and glass everywhere. The town crews showed up and started repairs, but the story about what happened spread fast. No one knew what the hovering shape was. Some said it was a drone, others joked about government experiments, but no one could explain the silence it came with, or how it just disappeared when hit by a rock. Since then, I've gone back to the field a few times, but it never felt quite right. The place is the same, sure, grass, dirt, fences, but when I'm there, I can't shake the feeling I'm not alone. Sometimes when I'm driving home at night, I catch a flicker in the sky, just out of the corner of my eye, a shadow that doesn't belong, hanging just a little too still. I can't say what that was or why it came to Springfield that night. I only know that the baseball field lights blew out exactly in the moment it vanished. And after that, my phone's clock went all screwy for a bit. And whatever that thing was, it didn't want us throwing rocks at it.